When the fifth mail-order bride stepped off that wagon into the Montana darkness, rancher Caleb Voss already had his rejection speech prepared. He'd sent 4 women running before dawn, terrified by his coldness, his ruined cabin, his dead wife's ghost hanging in every corner. But Eliza Rowan didn't run. She didn't cry. She walked straight past his threats into that filthy house and lit a fire in a stove that hadn't burned in 2 years. That single act of defiance would ignite something far more dangerous than flame. It would resurrect 2 people who'd already given up on living. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The wagon that brought Eliza Rowan to the Voss homestead arrived 3 hours past sunset, which meant she couldn't see what she'd gotten herself into until it was too late to turn back. Not that she would have. Women like Eliza, women who'd burned through their last option 6 months ago, didn't have the luxury of second thoughts. The driver, a man named Hutchins, who'd barely spoken 20 words during the final leg of the journey, pulled the horses to a stop in front of a structure that was less a cabin and more an accusation against the concept of shelter. Even in the darkness, Eliza could see the broken porch rail, the missing shutter, the chimney that listed like a drunk. "This is it," Hutchins said. Not a question. A warning. Eliza climbed down, her legs screaming from 3 weeks of being folded into impossible positions across trains, stagecoaches, and finally this wagon that seemed designed specifically to destroy the human spine. Her traveling dress, the nice one she'd saved for arrival, was gray with dust and spotted with stains she couldn't identify and didn't want to. "Mr. Voss expecting you?" Hutchins asked, though his tone suggested he knew the answer. He should be. Eliza lifted her bag from the wagon bed. It wasn't heavy. Everything she owned fit inside it with room to spare. "The letters." "Yeah," Hutchins spat into the dirt. "The letters. You ain't the first woman to come up here with letters, miss. You might want to keep that in mind." Before Eliza could ask what that meant, the cabin door opened. The man who filled the doorway wasn't what she'd expected. His letters, sparse, grammatically questionable, but functional, had given her the outline. Widower, ranch, Montana, need a wife. She'd imagined someone older, perhaps worn down by grief but still fundamentally decent. A man looking for partnership in a hard land. Caleb Voss looked like something that had crawled out of winter and forgotten how to die. He was tall, built broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested hard work rather than natural blessing. His hair needed cutting, his jaw needed shaving. His eyes, even in the weak light spilling from behind him, looked like they hadn't seen anything worth looking at in a very long time. "No," he said. Just that. One word. No greeting, no introduction, no acknowledgement that a woman had just traveled 2,000 miles to stand in his yard. Eliza felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd known this might be difficult. She'd prepared herself for awkwardness, for the strangeness of meeting a future husband through ink and paper. She had not prepared herself for instant rejection. "Mr. Voss?" She tried to keep her voice steady. "I'm Eliza Rowan. We've been corresponding. I know who you are." He didn't move from the doorway. "And I'm telling you no. Hutchins will take you back to town. There's a boarding house. You can catch the eastbound stage day after tomorrow." And Hutchins shifted on the wagon seat. "Now, Caleb..." "Stay out of it, Hutchins." "I came all this way," Eliza said. Her hands had started to shake, so she gripped her bag tighter. "You sent for me. You wrote..." "I changed my mind." "When? An hour ago? A day ago?" The shake had moved from her hands into her voice, but it was anger now, not fear. "I've been traveling for 3 weeks. 3 weeks in trains and coaches and that godforsaken wagon. I sold everything I had to make this trip. I left..." She stopped herself. He didn't need to know what she'd left. "You don't get to change your mind now." Something flickered across Caleb's face. Not sympathy, maybe recognition. "Hutchins, take her back." "No." Eliza said it quietly, but the word landed like a stone in still water. Caleb's jaw tightened. "This isn't a negotiation." "You're right. It's not." Eliza picked up her bag and walked toward the cabin. She got 3 steps before Caleb moved to block her path. Up close, he was bigger than she'd realized, and there was something in the way he held himself that made her pulse skip. Not violence, exactly. More like the memory of it. Like a man who'd forgotten how to be around people who weren't trying to hurt him. "Turn around," he said. Eliza looked up at him, really looked, past the anger and the exhaustion and whatever else he was using to keep the world at arm's length. There were shadows under his eyes that had nothing to do with the late hour. His shirt, she noticed, had been mended badly. Uneven stitches that pulled the fabric wrong. The hand gripping the door frame was scarred across the knuckles. "How many?" she asked. That threw him. "What? How many women have you done this to?" Hutchins said I wasn't the first. Caleb's expression went flat. "That's none of your concern." "4," Hutchins called from the wagon. "You're number 5, miss." And he sent every one of them packing before sunrise. Eliza felt something hot and sharp rise in her throat. 4 women. 4 women who'd made this same impossible journey, who'd sold everything and left everything and risked everything, only to be turned away by a man who couldn't even bother to reject them in daylight. Why? She directed the question at Caleb, not Hutchins. "Why send for us at all if you're just going to—" "I told you, I changed my mind. 4 times? 5. His voice had gone dangerous and quiet. 5 times. Now get back in that wagon before I have Hutchins drag you into it. Eliza stood there, bag in hand, and felt the last 3 weeks collapse around her. The terror of leaving Boston, the shame of explaining to her landlady why she couldn't pay rent, the cold mathematics of discovering that she had 2 choices, mail-order bride or something worse, the shaking hands when she'd signed her name to the marriage agreement, the prayers, desperate, furious prayers, that this would be different, that she'd finally found bottom and could start climbing up. And here was bottom, deeper than she'd known it could go. "No," she said again. Caleb actually blinked. "What did you say?" "I said no." Eliza stepped around him into the cabin. The smell hit her first, not rot exactly, but the stale tang of a place where air hadn't moved in too long, where life had stopped and nothing had come in to replace it. The interior matched the exterior, broken furniture, dirt-crusted dishes, a cold stove that looked like it hadn't seen fire in months, maybe years. In the corner, barely visible in the weak light from a single oil lamp, she could see a bed with blankets that might have once been white. And above it, a shelf holding a photograph in a water-stained frame. A woman's face, young and smiling. The dead wife. Had to be. "Get out!" Caleb had followed her inside. "Right now! Get out!" Eliza set her bag on the only chair that didn't look like it would collapse. "Where's the well?" "What? The well? For water?" She started unbuttoning her traveling coat. "And firewood. Do you have any, or do I need to scavenge?" Caleb stared at her like she'd started speaking in tongues. "Are you out of your mind?" "Probably." Eliza draped her coat over her bag. Her hands were steadier now. Something about making a decision, even a terrible one, had settled her. "But I'm not getting back in that wagon. You want me gone? You're going to have to physically throw me out. And even then, I'll just sleep in your barn until Hutchins leaves." "I don't have a barn." "Then I'll sleep in the yard." "It's 40 degrees out there." "I've been colder." They stood there 2 feet apart, locked in something that wasn't quite a standoff because Eliza had already surrendered any ground worth defending. She had nothing left to lose. That made her more dangerous than he could possibly understand. Caleb looked at Hutchins, who'd appeared in the doorway. "You're seeing this?" "I am." Hutchins scratched his jaw. "Gotta say, Caleb, she's got more spine than the others." "That's not a compliment in this situation." "Ain't it?" Hutchins grinned. "Tell you what, I'll leave her here tonight. You two figure out whatever you're gonna figure out. I'll come back through in 3 days. If she wants to leave then, I'll take her to town. No charge." "Hutchins, 3 days ain't gonna kill neither of you." Hutchins tipped his hat to Eliza. "Ma'am, good luck with this stubborn bastard." And then he was gone, the wagon rattling away into the darkness before Caleb could stop him. The silence that followed felt like something physical, heavy enough to make breathing difficult. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Caleb finally said. Eliza looked around the filthy cabin at the cold stove and dirty dishes and the photograph of a dead woman. "Wouldn't be my first." She found the well out back, a decent stone structure that at least seemed functional. The firewood was stacked haphazardly beside the cabin, dry enough to burn, but scattered like someone had stopped caring midway through the task. She hauled water, gathered wood, and returned to find Caleb exactly where she'd left him, standing in the middle of his ruined home, like a man who'd forgotten how to move forward. "You can help," she said, dumping the wood beside the stove. "Or you can stand there. But I'm getting this fire started either way." "Why are you doing this?" Eliza knelt in front of the stove, pulling open the iron door. The firebox was full of old ash, never cleaned out. Of course. "Because I'm cold. Because I'm tired. Because I didn't come 2,000 miles to turn around without a fight." "This isn't your fight." "Isn't it?" She began scooping ash into a bucket she'd found, rusted but functional. "You sent letters. You made promises. You signed an agreement. Then you tried to throw me away like the 4 women before me. What do you call that?" "Smart." Caleb moved finally, but only to lean against the wall. "Those women were smart enough to leave. You should be too." "Maybe I'm not smart." Eliza finished clearing the firebox and started arranging kindling. "Maybe I'm desperate. Maybe I've got nowhere else to go. Did you consider that? Did you consider that some of us don't have the luxury of choices anymore?" That landed. She could tell by the way his jaw worked, like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite spit out. "You don't know what you're walking into," he said finally. "Then tell me." "No." Eliza struck a match. One of 3 she'd found in a tin on the shelf. The kindling caught, small flames licking up through the dry wood. She added larger pieces, carefully, building the fire the way her father had taught her before the factory accident that killed him, before everything fell apart. "My wife died 2 years ago," Caleb said suddenly. "Childbirth. The baby too." Eliza didn't turn around. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. You didn't know her." His voice had gone flat again, empty. "I couldn't keep this place running after that. Couldn't keep anything running. I thought maybe if I got help, if I brought someone in—" He stopped. "But I was wrong. Every time a woman shows up, I remember what I lost, what I'll never get back. And I can't do it, can't pretend to be something I'm not." "Who's asking you to pretend?" "You are. By being here. By acting like this can work." Eliza closed the stove door and stood. The fire was going now, real heat starting to build behind the iron. "I'm not her," she said quietly. "I don't know who she was or what she meant to you, and I'm not trying to replace her. I'm just trying to survive. Same as you." Caleb laughed, but there was no humor in it. "This isn't survival. This is just a slower way to die." "Maybe." Eliza picked up the bucket of ash and walked past him, out into the night to dump it. When she came back, he was still standing there, watching her like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. "But at least it's slower. That's worth something." She spent the next hour cleaning. Not deep cleaning, that would take days, maybe weeks, but enough to make the space bearable. She washed dishes using water heated on the now-burning stove. She swept the floor, raising clouds of dust that made her cough. She found blankets in a trunk and shook them out, then stopped when she realized they'd belonged to the dead wife. The whole cabin belonged to the dead wife. Eliza was a ghost trying to haunt a house that already had one. Caleb watched her work without helping, but also without leaving. He'd moved to the chair she'd dumped her bag on, relocated the bag to the floor, and now sat there like a man waiting for execution. "You should eat something," Eliza said eventually. "When's the last time you had a real meal?" "Don't remember." She checked the shelves and found supplies: beans, flour, salt pork, coffee. Enough to keep someone alive if they didn't care about living. She started coffee first because coffee solved nothing but made everything slightly more bearable. Then she got beans soaking and pork sliced and tried not to think about how domestic this looked. How much like surrender. "You don't have to do this," Caleb said. "I know." "Then why are you?" Eliza poured coffee into 2 cups that didn't match, handed one to him. "Because someone has to, and you're clearly not going to." He took the coffee but didn't drink it, just held it, letting the heat seep into his hands. The other women, they were smart. They saw what this place was and left before it could trap them. Or maybe they had somewhere else to go. Eliza sat down on the floor, her back against the wall. Everything hurt. Her legs, her back, her head. 3 weeks of travel plus tonight's war of wills had left her wrung out. Maybe they had families to go back to, money saved up, options. You don't? If I did, you think I'd be here? That silence again, but different this time. Less hostile, more aware, like two people finally seeing each other instead of whatever ghosts they'd been fighting. What happened? Caleb asked. Back east. What happened that made you desperate enough for this? Eliza considered lying, considered all the ways she could soften or hide or reshape her story into something less humiliating, but she was too tired for fiction. I worked in a textile mill, she said. 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages that barely covered a room in a boarding house. When the mill cut wages again last year, I tried to organize the other girls. Tried to get us to stand together, demand better. She smiled, bitter. Turns out mill owners don't like that. Got blacklisted. Couldn't find work anywhere in Boston after that. Couldn't pay rent. Couldn't eat. So you answered an advertisement. So I answered 4 advertisements. You were the only one who wrote back. She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. Lucky me. Caleb almost smiled. Almost. You've got a sharp tongue. It's gotten me in trouble before. I believe it. They sat there as the fire crackled and the coffee grew cold and the night pressed against the windows. 2 broken people in a broken house. Neither one quite sure what happened next. You can have the bed, Caleb said finally. I'll sleep out here. That's not necessary. It is. He stood, setting his untouched coffee on the floor. You're not my wife. You're not anything to me. But I'm not throwing you out into the cold either. So you take the bed. Tomorrow, when you've rested and thought clearly about this insanity, maybe you'll make the smart choice and leave. Eliza wanted to argue, wanted to insist on fair division of space, on not accepting charity from a man who clearly resented her presence. But exhaustion won. She nodded and stood, every muscle protesting. The bed was in the corner, separated from the main room by a curtain that had seen better decades. She pulled it closed and sat down on the mattress, which sagged in the middle, but was softer than anything she'd slept on in weeks. The photograph of the dead wife stared at her from its shelf. I'm not trying to replace you, Eliza whispered to the image. I just need somewhere to land. The woman in the photograph, frozen in eternal youth, didn't answer. Eliza lay down fully clothed, pulled a blanket over herself, and closed her eyes. Through the thin curtain, she could hear Caleb moving around, banking the fire, dragging something across the floor, settling in for a night on what sounded like a very uncomfortable surface. Good, she thought viciously. Let him hurt. Let him understand that choices had consequences. But sleep was already pulling her under, and her last conscious thought was softer. Please let this work. Please let me have made the right choice for once. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone trying very hard to be quiet. Morning light filtered through the window, weak and gray. Eliza sat up, disoriented for a moment before memory crashed back. Montana. The cabin. Caleb Voss and his rejection and her refusal to leave. She pulled aside the curtain to find Caleb at the stove, pouring coffee into those same mismatched cups. He turned when he heard her move, and in the daylight, she could see him more clearly. The exhaustion carved into his face, the way his clothes hung loose, like he'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. The careful way he moved, like a man trying not to disturb something fragile. Morning, he said, not friendly, but not hostile either. Morning. Eliza stood, smoothing her dress. It was hopelessly wrinkled, stained from travel. She probably looked like something dragged backward through disaster. Is that coffee for me? If you want it. She took the cup. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but she'd had worse. Thank you. Caleb nodded and moved to the window, staring out at whatever view Montana offered. Hutchins won't be back for 3 days. You mentioned that. Which means you're stuck here. With me. In this. He gestured at the cabin without turning around. I know. And you're still not leaving. It wasn't quite a question, but Eliza answered anyway. No. Caleb's shoulders rose and fell, a sigh too deep for sound. You're going to regret this. Probably. Eliza drank her coffee and looked around the cabin in full daylight. It was worse than she'd thought. Dirt ground into every surface, clothes piled in corners. That photograph of the dead wife watching everything with her frozen smile. But regret's familiar. I can work with regret. What's that supposed to mean? It means I've made bad decisions before and survived them. This might be another bad decision, but at least it's mine. She set down her cup. Now, where do you keep the cleaning supplies? Because if I'm going to be here 3 days, I'm not living in this filth. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. There's a difference. Eliza started opening cabinets, looking for rags, soap, anything useful. You can help, or you can get out of the way. Your choice. Caleb stood there for a long moment, clearly torn between throwing her out bodily and just surrendering. Finally, he pointed to a cabinet near the sink. Soap's in there. Rags too, probably. Haven't used them in a while. I can tell. That almost got a smile out of him. Almost. For the next several hours, Eliza cleaned like her life depended on it, because maybe it did. Maybe the only way forward was to make this broken place into something bearable, to prove that she could be useful, that her presence was worth tolerating. Caleb disappeared outside after an hour, muttering something about fence repairs. Eliza didn't mind. She worked better alone anyway, scrubbing floors and washing windows and beating dust out of everything that could be beaten. The cabin fought back. Every surface revealed new layers of neglect, new evidence of a life that had stopped caring. But slowly, grudgingly, it started to transform. By noon, the floors were clean. The windows let in actual light. The dishes were washed and stacked. The stove gleamed dully, functional if not beautiful. Eliza had found a broom and swept out the fireplace, reorganized the shelves, and even managed to get the worst stains out of the table. She was dumping dirty water outside when she saw it. Behind the cabin, barely visible through overgrown weeds, the skeleton of a garden. Something in her chest tightened. Raised beds, rotted but still recognizable. Stakes for climbing plants, fallen over but still present. The ghost of careful planning, of someone who'd tried to make beauty in this hard place. The dead wife's garden. Had to be. Eliza walked over slowly, picking her way through dead growth. The beds were full of weeds now, choked with 2 years of neglect. But underneath, she could see the bones of what it had been. Tomatoes here, beans there, herbs in the smaller bed near the back. Someone had loved this garden, had tended it with care. She spent every morning out there. Eliza jumped. She hadn't heard Caleb approach. He stood at the edge of the garden, hands shoved in his pockets, looking at the ruined beds like they physically hurt him. Before the sun got too hot. She'd be out here talking to the plants like they could understand her. She swore they grew better when she did. Maybe they did, Eliza said quietly. After she died, I couldn't look at it, couldn't maintain it. Letting it die felt like... He stopped, swallowed hard. Felt like the only honest thing left to do. They stood there in the wreckage of someone else's hope, and Eliza understood. This wasn't just about a garden. It was about every dream that had died with his wife, every future that had collapsed, every morning he'd woken up and chosen to let it all rot rather than try to save it. What was her name? Eliza asked. Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, Sarah. Her name was Sarah. Sarah made a beautiful garden. Yeah, she did. Eliza looked at the weeds, the collapsed stakes, the beds that needed clearing and rebuilding. I could fix it if you wanted, not to replace what she did, but to honor it, to make something grow again. Caleb's jaw worked. Why would you do that? Because I'm good at it. Because it needs doing. Because maybe if she could make something grow in this dead place, she could prove that life was still possible, that grief didn't have to be the end of everything. Do what you want, Caleb said finally. I'm not stopping you. He walked away back toward the fence line he'd been repairing, leaving Eliza alone with Sarah's ghost and a decision to make. She could leave the garden dead, could respect the sanctity of grief and let the past stay buried, or she could do what she'd always done, put her hands in the dirt and try to make something grow anyway. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. That night, after another meal cooked on the now functional stove, after more silence and more careful distance, Eliza lay in Sarah's bed and stared at Sarah's photograph and thought about the garden waiting outside. 3 days until Hutchins returned. 3 days to prove she belonged here, or to admit defeat and leave. 3 days to decide if she was brave enough to plant seeds in haunted ground. Through the curtain, she could hear Caleb's breathing, rough and irregular, like a man fighting sleep, like someone afraid of what dreams might bring. Eliza closed her eyes and made a promise to no one in particular. I'll stay. Whatever it takes, however hard it gets, I'll stay. The photograph of Sarah didn't respond. But somewhere deep in the night, Eliza could have sworn she felt something shift. Like the house itself was listening. Like maybe, against all odds, there was room here for two ghosts after all. The morning Eliza started on the garden, frost still clung to the dead stalks like tiny glass beads. She'd woken before dawn, habit from the mill days, when sleeping past 5 meant losing wages, and found Caleb already gone. His blankets were folded with military precision on the floor where he'd been sleeping, the coffee pot still warm on the stove. She poured herself a cup and stood at the window, watching pale light creep across the Montana landscape. It was beautiful in a harsh way, all angles and distances that made her feel small. Back in Boston, buildings had pressed close, thousands of lives stacked on top of each other. Here, space stretched so far it made her dizzy. The garden waited. Eliza dressed in her oldest clothes, a work dress she'd packed thinking she might need it, now grateful for the foresight, and went outside. The morning air bit at her exposed skin, sharp enough to make her eyes water. She'd need better clothing if she stayed. Warmer things. Montana didn't care about her Boston wardrobe. The raised beds looked worse in daylight. 2 years of neglect had turned Sarah's careful work into a tangle of dead vines and aggressive weeds. Eliza knelt beside the first bed and started pulling, her fingers clumsy in the cold. The roots came up stubborn, clinging to soil that hadn't been turned in too long. She'd been working maybe an hour when Caleb's shadow fell across the bed. "You're actually doing this," he said. Eliza didn't look up. "I said I would." Saying and doing are different things. Not for me. She yanked out a particularly stubborn root system, dirt spraying across her dress. "I don't make promises I can't keep." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he knelt down beside her and started pulling weeds from the other end of the bed. His hands moved efficiently, like he'd done this before, like muscle memory was overriding whatever resistance he'd built up. They worked in silence for 20 minutes before Eliza asked, "What did she plant here?" "Tomatoes. She loved tomatoes." Caleb's voice was rough. "Used to eat them like apples, warm from the vine. Salt on her fingers, juice running down her chin. She'd laugh when I told her it wasn't ladylike." Eliza's chest tightened. "She sounds like she knew how to be happy." "She did. Better than anyone I ever met." He sat back on his heels, staring at the cleared section of bed. "I don't know if I can watch something grow here again." "Then don't watch. Just help me clear it." "That's the same thing." "No, it isn't. Clearing is about the past. Growing is about the future." Eliza moved to the next section, her fingers already raw from the cold and the work. "You don't have to think about the future yet. Just help me deal with what's dead." Caleb studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Then he went back to pulling weeds, and they didn't speak again until the sun was high enough to burn off the frost. By noon, they'd cleared 2 beds completely and made good progress on a third. Eliza's hands were bleeding in places where thorns had caught her, and her back screamed every time she straightened up. But the beds looked better. Still broken, still needing work, but no longer quite so hopeless. "You need gloves," Caleb said, looking at her torn fingers. "I need a lot of things." "I'll see what I can find." He stood, brushing dirt from his pants. "There's stew from last night. You should eat." Eliza wanted to refuse, wanted to prove she could work straight through without breaks like the men in the mill supervisors' offices always claimed women couldn't. But her stomach betrayed her with a loud growl that made Caleb's mouth twitch in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Fine," she said, "but then I'm coming back out." Didn't figure otherwise. They ate standing up, bowls in hand, both too filthy to sit at the newly cleaned table. The stew was better warmed up. The flavors had settled overnight into something almost good. Eliza made a mental note about what spices they had, what they needed, what she might be able to grow if she stayed long enough. If. The word sat heavy in her mind. 2 more days until Hutchins returned. 2 more days to prove her value, to make herself indispensable, to show Caleb that she could be useful without trying to replace what he'd lost. Why mail order? Caleb asked suddenly. You're educated. You can read and write, do arithmetic. You could have found work as a governess or a teacher. Eliza set her empty bowl in the basin. You need references for that. Letters from respectable people vouching for your character and morals. And you don't have those? I have letters from mill girls who got blacklisted alongside me. From the woman who ran the boarding house before she threw me out for missing rent. From the priest at St. Catherine's who watched me organize workers instead of accepting poverty as blessed virtue. She laughed, but it came out bitter. Not exactly the kind of references that open doors. Caleb was quiet. Then, the organizing, that took guts. It took stupidity. Guts would have been doing it smart enough not to get caught. Maybe. Or maybe Guts is doing the right thing even when you know it'll cost you. Eliza looked at him, surprised. It was the first kind thing he'd said since she'd arrived. The first hint that maybe, underneath all the grief and anger, there was still a man who understood what it meant to stand up when standing up hurt. What happened to your wife? She said carefully. That wasn't your fault. Caleb's expression went flat. You don't know that. I know childbirth. I know it kills women every day, rich and poor, strong and weak. I know it's not something a man can prevent by wanting hard enough. I should have gotten her to town, to a real doctor. How far is town? 20 miles? And she went into labor when? Caleb's jaw worked. Middle of the night, fast. The baby was coming wrong, and by the time I realized, he stopped, set his bowl down with hands that shook slightly. I tried. I got her in the wagon, started driving, but we didn't make it 5 miles before he didn't finish, didn't need to. Eliza wanted to reach out, to offer comfort in the way women were supposed to comfort men, but something about Caleb's posture told her that touch would be unwelcome, that he'd built walls too high for casual sympathy to breach. I'm sorry, she said instead. For what it's worth? I'm sorry. It's worth nothing. Sorry doesn't bring them back. No, but it's what we've got. Eliza picked up both bowls and started washing them. And I'm still clearing that garden. You can help or not. Your choice. She went back outside without waiting for an answer. Caleb joined her 10 minutes later, carrying a pair of worn leather gloves. These were mine, he said, handing them over. They'll be too big, but better than bleeding. Eliza pulled them on. He was right. They swallowed her hands, made her fingers clumsy, but they protected her torn skin from further damage. Thank you. They worked until the light started to fade, clearing the last bed and beginning to repair the collapsed stakes. It was hard work, physical in a way that made Eliza's mill job seem easy by comparison. But there was something satisfying about it too, something honest. She could see the progress, measure it in cleared soil and straightened wood. As the sun dropped toward the mountains, Caleb straightened up and looked at what they'd accomplished. She'd like this, he said quietly. Sarah, she'd like that someone cared enough to fix it. I hope so. But you're not doing it for her, are you? Eliza met his eyes. No, I'm doing it for me. Because I need to believe that broken things can be repaired, that effort matters, that... She stopped, surprised by her own honesty. That what? That I can make something good out of the worst decision of my life. Caleb's expression softened slightly. Coming here, you mean? Coming here. Leaving Boston. Organizing those mill girls in the first place. Take your pick. Eliza pulled off the gloves and flexed her sore fingers. I've made a lot of bad choices, but I'm tired of running from them. I'd rather stay and see if I can make something work for once. Even if I don't want you here? Even then. They stood in the gathering dark, two stubborn people who'd both lost too much to surrender easily. Then Caleb picked up the tools and headed for the cabin, and Eliza followed, too tired to do anything but move forward. That night, after another simple meal and more careful silence, Caleb didn't immediately retreat to his floor pallet. Instead, he poured coffee for both of them and sat at the table, gesturing for Eliza to join him. Hutchins comes back tomorrow, he said. I know. You could leave, go back east, try again somewhere else. With what money? What references? Eliza wrapped her hands around her cup, savoring the warmth. I told you, I've got nowhere else to go. There's always somewhere else. Is there? Where were you planning to go when you sent for bride number 1, or 2, or 3, or 4? She leaned forward. We're both trapped, Caleb. The only question is whether we're trapped separately or together. That's not much of a choice. It's the only one we've got. Caleb stared into his coffee like it might hold answers. I can't be what you need. Can't be a husband. Can't be... I'm not asking you to be anything. I'm asking you to let me stay. Eliza's voice stayed steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. Let me work. Let me earn my place here. You don't have to love me. You don't even have to like me. Just don't send me away. And if I do anyway, then I'll leave. When Hutchins comes, I'll get in that wagon and go. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she needed him to believe he had power here, needed him to make the choice willingly rather than out of guilt or obligation. But I'm asking you not to. I'm asking you to take a chance on someone who's got nothing left to lose. The silence stretched long enough to hurt. Then Caleb said, 1 month. Eliza's heart jumped. What? 1 month. You stay, you work, you pull your weight. End of that month, we reassess. Decide if this arrangement is tolerable or insane. He looked at her directly for the first time since she'd arrived. But you sleep in the spare room. I'll clear it out tomorrow. And we're clear on what this is. Business arrangement. Nothing more. Business arrangement, Eliza repeated. I can work with that. And if it doesn't work, if either of us decides this is untenable, you leave. No arguments, no dramatics. Agreed. Caleb extended his hand across the table. Eliza took it, his palm rough with calluses against hers. They shook once, formal as strangers, sealing a bargain that felt both like salvation and surrender. 1 month, Caleb said again. 1 month. The next morning, Hutchins arrived to find Eliza in the garden, transplanting wildflowers she'd found growing near the creek. She stood when she saw the wagon, dirt on her cheeks and hope in her chest. Hutchins looked between her and Caleb, who'd come out of the barn carrying a broken harness. Well, Hutchins said, this is unexpected. She's staying, Caleb said. For now. That right? Hutchins grinned at Eliza. Guess you're tougher than you look, miss. Guess so. Any messages you need me to carry? Letters to send? Eliza thought about it. Who would she write to? The mill girls who'd scattered after the blacklisting? The landlady who'd thrown her out? There was no one back east who cared if she lived or died. No, she said. No messages. Hutchins tipped his hat. Good luck to you both, then. Something tells me you're going to need it. He drove off, leaving them alone in a silence that felt different than before. Less hostile, more uncertain. Spare room's clear, Caleb said. Such as it is. Mostly storage and mouse droppings, but there's a cot in there now. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, you haven't seen it. The room was tiny, barely big enough for the cot and a small trunk, but it had a window that looked out toward the mountains, and it was hers. Eliza set her bag on the cot and felt something loosen in her chest. Space of her own. In a place she'd chosen, however desperately. That was worth more than Caleb could possibly understand. The days developed a rhythm after that. Eliza woke early, started coffee, worked in the garden until the sun got too high. Then she'd move inside, cooking, cleaning, mending clothes that had been neglected for too long. Caleb worked the ranch, such as it was, repairing fences, tending the handful of cattle that had survived his grief, chopping wood for winter that was already creeping closer. They orbited each other carefully, 2 planets held in reluctant gravity. Polite, but distant. Functional, but not friendly. Until the day Eliza found the letters. She'd been cleaning out a cabinet, looking for something to store the vegetables she was planning to put up once the garden produced. Behind a stack of plates she'd never seen used, she found a bundle of envelopes tied with string. The handwriting on the front was feminine, educated. The return addresses were different: Boston, Philadelphia, New York, St. Louis. The other brides. Eliza knew she shouldn't read them, knew it was a violation of privacy, of the fragile trust she and Caleb were building. But her hands opened the first envelope anyway. The letter was from a woman named Catherine, written from Philadelphia 3 months before Eliza arrived. It was polite, hopeful, carefully composed. She talked about her skills, cooking, sewing, managing a household. She mentioned her family, deceased parents, and a brother in the army. She asked gentle questions about Montana, about the ranch, about what kind of life they might build together. The second letter was from Margaret in New York. Older, by the sound of it. A widow looking for a fresh start. She wrote about loneliness, about the difficulty of making a life alone in a city that didn't care if you starved in the streets. She asked for honesty. Was this a marriage or a business arrangement? Either was acceptable, she wrote, as long as he was clear. The third letter was from a woman who signed only as Rose. The handwriting was shaky, the spelling creative. She'd written from St. Louis, working in a laundry, desperate enough that her letter read like begging. Please, she'd written, I'll work hard. I won't be trouble. I just need somewhere safe. Eliza's hands shook as she read the fourth letter. Then the fifth. Then the replies. Caleb's letters, drafted but never sent, making excuses. The journey was too hard. The ranch was too isolated. He'd made a mistake. All lies. All ways of pushing away women who'd reached out with whatever courage they had left. What are you doing? Eliza turned to find Caleb in the doorway, his expression dark. I found them, she said. The letters from the other women. Those are private. They're heartbreaking. Eliza held up Rose's letter. This woman was desperate. They all were, and you rejected them without even meeting them, without giving them a chance. I gave them a chance by letting them leave before they got trapped here. You think that's kindness? Eliza's voice rose. You think sending desperate women back into situations bad enough that they answered advertisements from strangers is mercy? Better than the alternative. Which is what? Living here? Working hard? Building something? She gestured around the now clean cabin. This isn't a prison, Caleb. It's a home. Or it could be if you'd stop punishing yourself long enough to let someone in. Caleb's face went hard. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? I read these letters. These women were willing to take a risk on you, all of them. And you threw that away because you're too scared to... Scared? Caleb stepped into the room, and Eliza saw real anger now. You think this is about fear? What else would you call it? Self-preservation, reality, understanding that some things can't be fixed by sheer stubbornness. He grabbed the letters from her hands. These women deserve better than what I could give them, so I sent them away. That's not cruelty. That's honesty. It's cowardice. The word hung between them like a challenge. Caleb's jaw worked. Get out. This is my room now. You get out. This is my house, and I'm your wife. The words exploded out of Eliza before she could stop them. Or I would be if you'd stop hiding long enough to actually marry me. If you'd stop using your grief as an excuse to... She didn't see him move. 1 second he was 3 feet away, the next he was in her face, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his eyes. Don't, he said, voice deadly quiet. Don't you dare talk about my grief like you understand it. Eliza's heart hammered, but she didn't back down. I understand loss. I understand being so broken you can't see a way forward. I understand waking up every morning wishing you hadn't. Then you should understand why I can't do this. I understand why you're afraid to try. That's different. They stood there, close enough to touch, both breathing hard. Eliza could smell wood smoke on his clothes, see the exhaustion carved into his face, could see the man beneath the armor he'd built. I'm not afraid, Caleb said finally. Yes, you are. You're terrified. Because if you let me stay, really stay, not just for a month but permanently, you'd have to admit that life goes on, that Sarah is gone and you're still here, and maybe that means you deserve to be happy again. I don't deserve... Yes, you do, Eliza's voice gentled. You deserve a life, a real one, and so do I. So did Catherine and Margaret and Rose and whoever else you turned away. We all deserve better than this half-existence you're clinging to. Caleb stepped back like she'd hit him. You don't know what you're asking. I'm not asking for anything except a chance. Let me stay. Let me work. Let me prove that this can be something other than a monument to what you lost. And if I can't give you that, then we're both going to die alone in places that don't want us. And what a waste that would be. She pushed past him, out of the tiny room, out of the cabin entirely. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose. The garden stretched before her, still mostly weeds, but showing hints of potential, of what it could become with time and work and stubborn refusal to quit. Eliza sat down on the porch steps and put her face in her hands. She'd pushed too hard, said too much, violated his privacy and thrown his grief in his face like a weapon. He'd probably throw her out tomorrow, and she'd deserve it. But underneath the shame, she felt something else. Relief, maybe. Or just exhaustion from carrying the weight of politeness and distance for days. They'd been circling each other like wounded animals, and maybe it was better to just bleed out in the open. At least then you knew where you stood. The door opened behind her. My wife loved sunsets, Caleb said. She'd make me stop whatever I was doing to watch them with her. Said they were proof that endings could be beautiful. Eliza didn't turn around. She sounds like she was wise. She was young, 22 when she died. Not enough time to be wise. Wisdom isn't about time, it's about paying attention. Caleb sat down beside her, careful to leave space between them. They watched the sun sink lower, the sky bruising purple and orange. I read your letter, he said finally. The one you sent, before you came. Eliza's stomach dropped. And? You didn't beg. You didn't make promises about being perfect or grateful. You just laid out the facts. I need somewhere to go. You need help. Maybe we can make that work. He paused. That's why I picked you, because you seemed like you understood that this was a transaction, not a romance. I did understand that. I do. But you want more now. I want to stop feeling like I'm on trial every second. I want to stop wondering if tomorrow's the day you change your mind again. Eliza pulled her knees up to her chest. I want to plant seeds in that garden and know I'll be here to harvest them. That's all. That's not all. You want me to let go of Sarah, to move forward like she never existed. No. Eliza looked at him finally. I want you to let her memory exist without it consuming everything else. There's a difference. Caleb studied her face in the dying light. You're not what I expected. Good or bad? Haven't decided yet. They sat in silence as the sun disappeared completely and stars began to prick through the darkening sky. Montana nights were different from Boston nights, bigger somehow, like the darkness went on forever. 1 month? Caleb said eventually. That was the deal. It's been 4 days. I know. So we've got 26 more to figure out if this is sustainable or insane. And if it's both? That got something that might have been a laugh out of him. Then I guess we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Eliza felt some of the tension drain from her shoulders. Not forgiveness, maybe, but not rejection either. Just continuation, permission to keep trying. I'm sorry I read the letters, she said. That was wrong. Yeah, it was. And I'm sorry I threw your grief at you like it was something to be ashamed of. But you're not sorry for what you said. No, I'm not. Caleb stood, brushing dust from his pants. At least you're honest. I'll give you that. He went inside, leaving Eliza alone with the stars and the sound of wind through the grass. She sat there until the cold drove her in, and when she finally entered the cabin, she found that Caleb had left a blanket on her cot and a cup of tea cooling on the trunk. Small gestures, tiny accommodations, but they felt like progress. The next weeks unfolded in a pattern of work and slow, painful thawing. Eliza threw herself into the garden with something approaching obsession, clearing and planting and coaxing life from soil that had forgotten how to give it. Caleb fixed things, the sagging porch, the broken shutters, the fence that had been listing for 2 years. They worked separately but in parallel, rebuilding a life one small repair at a time. They talked more, not about anything important at first, just practical matters. The weather, what supplies they needed from town, whether the cattle looked healthy. But gradually, carefully, the conversations deepened. Caleb told her about growing up in Missouri, about coming west to make his fortune and finding only hard work, about meeting Sarah at a church social in town and knowing instantly that she was too good for him but asking anyway. Eliza talked about Boston, about her parents who died when she was 15 and left her with nothing, about the mill and the girls she'd worked alongside, their fingers bleeding from the machines, their lungs full of cotton dust, about the moment she had decided to organize them, knowing it would probably destroy her but unable to stay silent. You're an idealist, Caleb said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching another sunset. I'm a realist who wishes things were different. That's not the same thing. Close enough. What about you? What are you? Caleb considered. Broken, mostly. Trying to figure out if the pieces can still fit together into something functional. That's the most honest thing you've said since I got here. Don't get used to it. But there was warmth in his voice now. Not affection, exactly. More like the beginnings of friendship, of partnership. It was enough. For now, it was enough. 3 weeks into her stay, Eliza was in town buying supplies when she first heard the name Wade Mercer. The shopkeeper, a tired-looking man named Garrett, was filling her order when a woman came in, her face pale and hands shaking. Please, the woman said. Just a little more time. My husband's trying to... I don't make the rules, Mrs. Chen. Garrett's voice was kind but firm. Mr. Mercer says you're 3 months behind. Either you pay by Friday or... Or what? He takes our land, our home? The woman's voice cracked. We've got nowhere else to go. I'm sorry, I truly am, but it's not my decision. The woman left, and Eliza watched through the window as she climbed into a wagon that had seen better years. A man sat in the driver's seat, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Who's Wade Mercer? Eliza asked. Garrett's expression closed off. Nobody you need to worry about. That woman seemed pretty worried. That woman should have paid her debts on time. Something in his tone made Eliza's instincts flare, the same instincts that had told her the mill owners were cheating workers long before she had proof. What kind of debts? The kind that aren't your concern, miss. Now, did you want anything else? Eliza bought her supplies and left, but the encounter stuck with her. That woman's fear. Garrett's careful neutrality. The way everyone in the store had gone quiet when Mercer's name was mentioned. She asked Caleb about it that night. His reaction was immediate and visceral. Stay away from Wade Mercer. Why? Who is he? Caleb stopped, jaw working. He's a man who takes advantage of desperate people. He loans money, buys debts, acquires land when people can't pay. Half the valley owes him something. Do you? The pause was answer enough. Caleb, it's handled, or it will be. Just stay away from him. But Eliza had spent too many years watching the powerful exploit the powerless to let it go. How much do you owe him? Eliza, how much? $500. Maybe more with interest. I lost track after Sarah died. $500. A fortune. More money than Eliza had seen in her entire life. For what? Medical bills. The doctor I hired to try to save her. The medicine that didn't work. He stopped. I would have paid anything to save her. Mercer knew that. He gave me the money, and I used it, and now he owns a piece of this ranch. What piece? Water rights. Grazing access to the north pasture. Things I need to keep this place running. Caleb's hands had curled into fists. I've been making payments when I can, but it's never enough. He keeps adding fees, changing terms, says I'm in default. That's not legal. Legal doesn't matter out here. Power matters. And Mercer has it. Eliza felt cold certainty settle in her stomach. That's why you sent for brides. You needed help paying him back. Partly. Also because I was drowning and too proud to admit it. Caleb met her eyes. But every woman who showed up, I'd look at them and think about what would happen if Mercer decided to use them as leverage. So I sent them away before he could hurt them. You think he'd hurt women? I think he'd hurt anyone if it served his purpose. They sat in heavy silence, the weight of unpaid debts and dangerous men pressing down like the Montana sky. We'll figure it out, Eliza said finally. There's no we in this. It's my debt, my problem. We're married. We're not. Not really. A month trial, remember? You can still leave before this swallows you too. Eliza looked at him, this proud, broken man who'd been carrying impossible weight alone for too long. I'm not leaving. You might not have a choice. If Mercer decides to foreclose, then we'll fight him. You can't fight a man like that. Watch me. Caleb studied her face, and something shifted in his expression. Not hope, exactly. More like recognition. Like he was finally seeing her clearly. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, he said, or the most foolish. Probably both. This time, when he almost smiled, it reached his eyes. Wade Mercer came to the ranch on a Thursday morning, riding a black horse that probably cost more than Caleb made in a year. Eliza saw him from the garden, watched him dismount with the casual confidence of a man who'd never been told no in his life. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, well-dressed in a way that stood out against the rough country. His boots were polished, his coat fit properly. Everything about him screamed money and the kind of power that came with it. Caleb had been in the barn. He came out fast when he heard the horse, his whole body gone tense like a wire pulled too tight. "Voss," Mercer said, pleasant as Sunday morning. "Been a while." "Not long enough." Caleb stopped 10 feet away, maintaining distance. "What do you want?" "Just checking on my investment, making sure you're keeping up the property." Mercer's eyes drifted past Caleb to where Eliza stood, dirt on her hands and sweat on her face. "And who's this?" "Nobody you need to concern yourself with." Now, that's not very neighborly. Mercer smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Wade Mercer, ma'am. I own the bank in town, among other interests." Eliza walked over, wiping her hands on her apron. Something about this man set her teeth on edge, the way he looked at the ranch like he was already measuring it for a coffin. "Eliza Rowan." "Rowan," Mercer's eyebrows lifted. "Any relation to the Rowans in Boston? Textile family?" "No." The lie came easy. Her mother's maiden name had been Rowan, and there had been distant cousins in textiles. But Eliza had learned early that claiming family connections only invited questions she couldn't answer. "Shame. I do business with them occasionally." Mercer turned back to Caleb. "So you finally found yourself a bride willing to stay. Congratulations. Though I have to wonder if she knows what she's gotten herself into." "She knows enough," Caleb said. "Does she know about our arrangement, about the payment that's coming due next month?" Eliza felt Caleb stiffen beside her. "I've been making payments, partial payments, against an agreement that specified full monthly amounts." Mercer pulled a ledger from his saddlebag, flipped it open. "You're currently $2,300 in arrears, not counting the penalties for late payment." 2,000. Caleb's face went white. "That's not possible. The original loan was 500. At 12% interest, compounded monthly, with a penalty clause for any payment under the agreed amount." Mercer's smile widened. "It's all in the contract you signed. Perhaps you should have read it more carefully." "You son of a—" Eliza put a hand on Caleb's arm, stopping him before he could finish. She'd seen this before. Loan sharks in Boston, men who preyed on desperate workers with contracts designed to trap them. The numbers were always bigger in the West, but the pattern was the same. "May I see that contract?" she asked. Mercer studied her with new interest. "It's a private agreement between Mr. Voss and myself. And I'm Mr. Voss's wife, which makes his debts my concern." "Are you married? Legally, I mean. I haven't seen any notice filed with the county." The question hung there, sharp as a knife. Eliza felt Caleb's arm tense under her hand. "We're married," she said firmly. "The paperwork's being processed." Mercer didn't look convinced. "Well, either way, the debt stands. I'll expect payment in full by the end of next month. Otherwise, I'll be forced to exercise my right to foreclose on the water access and grazing land outlined in our agreement." "You can't take that land," Caleb said. "I need it to run cattle." "Then you'd better find a way to pay what you owe." Mercer closed his ledger and tucked it away. "Though I might be willing to discuss alternative arrangements, I'm not an unreasonable man." "What kind of arrangements?" "Well, I've been looking to expand my holdings in this valley. You sign over the deed to this property, and I'll forgive the debt entirely. You could even stay on as a tenant farmer. I'd be generous with the terms." Eliza's stomach turned. There it was. This had never been about collecting a debt. It was about taking land from a man too broken by grief to fight back. "Get off my property," Caleb said quietly. "Now, Voss, I said get off. Before I forget, I'm trying to be civilized." Mercer's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake. I've been patient with you out of respect for your loss, but my patience has limits. So does my tolerance for thieves dressed up as businessmen." For a moment, something dangerous flashed across Mercer's face. Then he smiled again, cold and calculated. "We'll see how brave you feel when winter comes and you've got no water for your cattle. Good day, Mrs. Rowan. I suspect we'll be seeing more of each other." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Eliza and Caleb standing in the yard like survivors of a storm. $2,000, Caleb said finally. "That's not possible. I've been paying it. It's a scam." Eliza's mind was already working through the angles. The interest rate is predatory. The penalty clause is designed to make it impossible to catch up. Men like him don't want you to pay off the debt. They want you to fail so they can take what you have. How do you know? Because I've seen it before. Different city, different victims, same pattern. She looked at Caleb. How many other people in this valley owe him money? Most of them, probably. He's the only source of credit for 50 miles. And how many have lost their land? Caleb's jaw worked. 3 families in the last year, maybe more. I stopped keeping track after Sarah died. Eliza felt something cold and furious settle in her chest. Back in Boston, she'd fought mill owners who treated workers like machines to be used and discarded. Here was the same evil wearing a different face. "We need to see that contract," she said. "He's not going to just hand it over." "No, but there might be other ways to get it." Caleb looked at her like she'd suggested robbing a bank. "What are you planning?" "I don't know yet, but I'm not letting him steal your land without a fight." "Our land," Caleb corrected quietly. "If you're really staying, it's our land, our fight." Something warm bloomed in Eliza's chest despite the circumstances. "Our land," she agreed. That night, Eliza lay awake in her small room thinking. She needed information, needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with before she could figure out how to fight it. The next morning, she told Caleb she was going to town for supplies. He offered to come with her, but she insisted on going alone. Some conversations were easier without an angry rancher standing behind you. The town, barely big enough to deserve the name, consisted of one main street with a dozen buildings clustered along it. Garrett's General Store, a saloon that looked like it had survived the Civil War through sheer spite, a blacksmith shop, and at the end of the street a building that stood out for its fresh paint and glass windows, Mercer's Bank. Eliza avoided it for now. Instead, she went to the general store. Garrett looked up when she entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Rowan, what can I do for you?" "Mrs. Voss, actually." She set her basket on the counter. "And I'm looking for information more than supplies." "Don't know much about anything these days." "That's not what I heard." Eliza kept her voice casual, friendly. "I heard you know everything that happens in this valley." Garrett's mouth twitched. Knowing and telling are different things. They are, but I'm not asking out of curiosity. I'm asking because Wade Mercer is trying to take our land, and I suspect we're not the only ones he's targeted. The store was empty except for the 2 of them, but Garrett still glanced toward the door before speaking. "You should be careful saying things like that." "Why? Is he listening?" "He might as well be. Man's got eyes everywhere." Eliza leaned against the counter. "The woman who was in here last week, Mrs. Chen, what's her story?" Garrett sighed. "Her husband took a loan to buy equipment. Farming's hard out here. Crop failed 2 years running. They couldn't make payments, so Mercer foreclosed. They've got until the end of the month to clear out. And where will they go?" "Don't know. Don't think they know either." "How many others?" "How many what?" "How many other families has Mercer done this to?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he went to the door, flipped the sign to closed, and pulled the shade. When he turned back, his expression was grim. "You really want to know?" "I really want to know." He pulled out a ledger. Not official, just a notebook with handwritten entries. "I keep track. Somebody should. The Hendersons lost their place last spring. The Kowalskis the year before. The Chens are next. There's probably a dozen families barely hanging on, one bad season away from foreclosure." Eliza scanned the names, her anger building. "This is organized theft. It's legal theft. Mercer's got contracts, lawyers, everything proper on paper. Legal doesn't make it right. No, but it makes it hard to fight." Eliza thought about the mill owners in Boston, how they'd hidden behind lawyers and contracts while girls bled on the factory floor. Nothing's impossible to fight. You just have to find the right pressure point. And what pressure point does a man like Mercer have? He owns half the county. Judge Whitmore owes him money. The sheriff... Garrett stopped himself. "The sheriff what?" "Nothing. Just that you can't count on official help." Eliza filed that information away. "What about unofficial help? If people banded together, they won't." Garrett's voice was flat. Everyone's too scared, too busy trying to keep their own heads above water. You stand up to Mercer alone, you go under. That's just how it is. That's how it is until someone changes it. You think you're that someone. I think I'm someone who's got nothing left to lose. That makes me dangerous. Garrett studied her for a long moment. Then he wrote something on a scrap of paper and handed it over. This is the name of a woman in Bozeman. Lawyer. One of the few who isn't in Mercer's pocket. She might be able to look at your contract, tell you if there's any legal recourse. Eliza took the paper. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, and don't tell anyone where you got that name. I've got a business to run, and Mercer controls the supply lines. He decides I'm a problem. I'm finished. I understand. She bought supplies to maintain the pretense, then left. But instead of going straight home, she walked to the saloon. It was early afternoon, quiet except for a few men nursing drinks and a woman behind the bar who looked like she'd stopped caring about much of anything around the time the paint started peeling. Help you? The woman asked. Information, Eliza said. I'm willing to pay for it. The woman's eyebrows rose. What kind of information? The kind about Wade Mercer, how he operates, who he's hurt, who might be willing to talk about it. That's dangerous information. I know. The woman poured herself a drink, studying Eliza over the rim of the glass. You're the one who married Caleb Voss. I am. He owes Mercer money. A lot of people owe Mercer money. Yeah, but most of them don't have pretty wives willing to ask questions in saloons. The woman set down her glass. I'm Rachel. I used to own this place outright. Now Mercer owns half, and I'm working myself to death to keep the other half. What happened? Same thing that happens to everyone. Needed capital to expand, took a loan, couldn't keep up with the payments once he started adding fees and penalties. Now he gets half my profits, and I get to keep working. Rachel's smile was bitter. But at least I still have a roof over my head. That's more than some can say. How does he get away with it? There must be laws. There are laws. Mercer follows them right up to the line, then finds ways around them. And the people who are supposed to enforce those laws? Rachel laughed. Judge Whitmore owes Mercer $1,500. Sheriff Carson's wife works in Mercer's bank. You see the problem? Eliza saw it clearly. It was the same web of corruption and mutual interest that had protected the mill owners. Different state, different specifics, same fundamental rot. What if people came forward together, she asked. Multiple witnesses, multiple victims, strength in numbers. You'd need a lot of witnesses, and you'd need them willing to risk everything to testify against a man who could destroy them with a word. Rachel shook her head. I admire the thought, but it's not practical. Maybe not, but I have to try. Why? You could leave, go back east. This isn't your fight. Yes, it is. Eliza met Rachel's eyes. Every time someone powerful preys on someone desperate, it's my fight. I didn't come 2,000 miles to watch it happen again and do nothing. Rachel studied her for a long moment. Then she pulled out a piece of paper and started writing. These are names. People who've lost land or businesses to Mercer. Most won't talk to you. They're too scared, but maybe one or two will. Thank you. Don't thank me. If Mercer finds out I gave you this, I'm finished. So you keep my name out of whatever you're planning. I will. Eliza left with the list burning in her pocket and a plan forming in her mind. It was risky. Probably stupid. But doing nothing meant watching Caleb lose everything, and she'd rather go down fighting than surrender without a war. When she got back to the ranch, Caleb was waiting on the porch, his expression dark. Where have you been? Town, gathering information. She showed him the list, the lawyer's name. We're not alone in this. Mercer's been doing this to people for years. I know that. Then why aren't they fighting back? Because they're scared. Because he has power and they don't. Because... Caleb stopped, frustration evident in every line of his body. Because fighting doesn't always work, Eliza. Sometimes the powerful win, and the rest of us just survive as best we can. Is that what you want? To just survive? To let him take what's yours without even trying to stop him? I want to protect you from making enemies you can't handle. Too late. I already made those enemies back in Boston. At least this time I know what I'm getting into. Caleb grabbed her shoulders, not rough, but firm enough to make her look at him. This isn't a game. Mercer is dangerous. He's ruined people for less than what you're planning. Then I'll be careful. Careful isn't enough. What do you want me to do, Caleb? Stand aside and watch? I can't do that. It's not who I am. They stood there, close enough that Eliza could see the fear in his eyes. Not fear of Mercer, fear for her. I can't lose anyone else, he said quietly. I can't watch someone else get destroyed by this place. Then help me fight. Don't make me do this alone. Caleb's hands dropped. You're asking me to risk everything. We're risking everything anyway. At least this way we go down swinging. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, not just the desperate mail-order bride who'd refused to leave. You're completely insane. Probably. And you're not going to let this go. No. Caleb laughed, sharp and bitter. Fine. What's your plan? Over the next week, Eliza worked quietly and carefully. She visited the families on Rachel's list, driving the wagon to scattered homesteads across the valley. Most wouldn't talk to her. They'd open their doors, see who she was, and politely but firmly send her away. But a few talked. A few let her in. The Hendersons, who'd lost their farm and now lived in a shack on someone else's land. Mr. Henderson worked as a day laborer. His wife took in washing. Their children, 3 of them, all under 10, looked hungry. He said the drought was an act beyond our control, Mrs. Henderson told Eliza, her voice shaking. Said we were in default because we couldn't make payments during a natural disaster, but the contract had a clause buried deep where we didn't see it, saying any missed payment for any reason meant full foreclosure. Eliza copied down every word, every detail. The Kowalskis, who'd lost their blacksmith shop and now lived in 2 rooms above the saloon. Mr. Kowalski had broken his arm in an accident, couldn't work for 3 months. Mercer had foreclosed while the man's arm was still in a splint. He offered to let me stay on as an employee, Kowalski said, his accent thick with bitterness. Work my own forge for wages instead of profits. I told him where he could put his offer. Good for you, Eliza said. Good for me? I've got nothing now. Pride doesn't feed a family. But he gave her the details of his contract anyway. The impossible terms. The hidden clauses. Slowly, painfully, a pattern emerged. Mercer didn't just loan money. He crafted traps. He found desperate people, offered them hope, then buried them in terms designed to guarantee failure. And every foreclosure made him richer, while his victims scattered like seeds on barren ground. Eliza brought her findings back to the ranch each night, spreading papers across the kitchen table. Caleb would sit across from her, reading testimonies that got angrier and more determined with each one. This is enough, he said finally. This is enough evidence to take to a judge. Judge Whitmore owes Mercer money, Eliza reminded him. Then we go over his head, take it to Denver, to the territorial authorities, and by the time they investigate, Mercer will have destroyed the evidence and intimidated the witnesses. We need something more immediate. Like what? Eliza had been thinking about this for days, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle. We need the original contracts, the ones he had people sign. If we can prove the terms were fraudulent, that he deliberately obscured the predatory clauses, those contracts are locked in his bank. I know. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Don't even think about it. I'm not thinking about it. I'm planning it. Eliza, hear me out. She leaned forward. Mercer's having a meeting next week. Big dinner at his house, all the wealthy men in the valley. Rachel told me about it. The bank will be closed and he'll be occupied for hours. And you think you can just break into his bank and steal contracts? I think I can look through public records and see if there's anything that doesn't match what he's claiming. It's not stealing. It's investigating. It's trespassing. It's breaking and entering. Caleb stopped, running his hands through his hair. It's insane. Do you have a better idea? He didn't. They both knew it. If you get caught, I won't get caught. But if you do, then I'll deal with the consequences. Eliza reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. I'm doing this, Caleb, with or without your help. But I'd rather have you with me. Caleb looked at their joined hands, his expression torn. Why? Why risk this much for people you don't even know? Because someone has to. Because standing by while bad people hurt good people makes you complicit. She squeezed his hand. And because this is our home now. Our land. Our life. I'm not letting him take it without a fight. Our life, Caleb repeated, like he was testing how the words felt. Then he looked up at her, and Eliza saw something new in his eyes, something that looked almost like hope. "You really mean that?" "I really mean that. Even though I've been difficult and cold and pushed you away at every turn? Even though," Caleb turned his hand over, gripping hers properly, "I'm still not sure this is smart." "Probably isn't. But we're doing it anyway." "Yeah, we are." The night of Mercer's dinner, Eliza dressed in dark clothes and waited until full dark. Caleb had argued for coming with her, but they decided it was safer if he stayed visible, at the ranch, where anyone checking would see him going about normal evening routines. The ride to town took an hour. Eliza left the horse tied in the trees behind the bank and approached on foot, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. The bank's back door was locked, but the window beside it wasn't latched properly. Eliza worked it open carefully, thanking years of living in boarding houses where locked doors were suggestions and privacy was a joke. Inside, the bank was dark and quiet. Eliza lit a small lantern, just enough light to see by, and started searching. The contracts were filed alphabetically in a cabinet behind Mercer's desk. Eliza found Caleb's first, her hands shaking as she read through it. There, buried in paragraph 7, subsection C, was the clause about compounding interest and penalty fees, written in language so dense and legal that no one without a law degree would understand what they were signing. She found the Henderson contract, the Kowalski contract, others she recognized from her visits. Every single one had the same hidden traps, the same deliberately obscure language, the same designed-to-fail terms. Eliza was copying down key passages when she heard it. Voices outside. She froze, lantern in hand, as footsteps approached the front door. Keys rattled in the lock. There was no time to climb back out the window, no time to hide properly. Eliza blew out the lantern and pressed herself into the corner behind a filing cabinet, hardly breathing. The door opened. Lamplight spilled in, and with it came Wade Mercer's voice. "I'll just be a moment. Need to retrieve some documents for tomorrow's meeting." "Of course, Mr. Mercer." A woman's voice. His secretary, probably. Eliza watched through the gap between the cabinet and wall as Mercer walked to his desk, unlocked a drawer, and pulled out a folder. He was less than 10 feet away. If he turned, if he looked in her direction, but he didn't. He took what he needed and left, locking the door behind him. Eliza stayed frozen for a full minute after his footsteps faded, her heart hammering and hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the contracts. That was too close, too risky. But she had what she needed. She climbed back out the window, closed it carefully behind her, and rode home through darkness that felt like it was full of eyes. Caleb was waiting on the porch, pacing. When he saw her, relief flooded his face. "You're back." "I'm back." Eliza dismounted, her legs shaky. "And I've got enough to bury him." They spread the copied passages across the kitchen table, comparing contracts, finding patterns. Every document had the same predatory structure, the same hidden traps, the same designed-to-fail terms. "This is fraud," Caleb said, "clear as day." "It is. But we still need someone in authority to care about it." "The lawyer and Bozeman will take months to build a case. We don't have months." Eliza stared at the papers, thinking. "We need public pressure. We need people angry enough to demand action." How? An idea was forming. Risky, possibly stupid, but maybe, just maybe, the kind of thing that could work. "We call a meeting," Eliza said slowly. "Everyone Mercer's hurt, everyone he's threatened. We present the evidence publicly. Make it so he can't just quietly destroy people one at a time. They won't come, they're too scared. Then we make them less scared. We show them they're not alone." Eliza looked at Caleb. "You said half the valley owes Mercer something. That means half the valley has a stake in stopping him. We just have to convince them it's possible." "And how do we do that?" "We start by being brave enough to stand up first. The rest will follow, or they won't. But at least we'll have tried." Caleb studied her face in the lamplight. "You really believe that?" "I have to. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this?" He reached across the table and took her hand. "When this is over, if we survive it, remind me to properly marry you. Because apparently I accidentally found myself the most stubborn, fearless woman in Montana." Eliza felt warmth bloom in her chest. "Is that a proposal?" "It's a promise. assuming we live long enough. We'll live, out of sheer spite if nothing else. Caleb almost smiled. I believe it. They spent the next 3 days spreading the word quietly. Caleb rode to neighboring ranches. Eliza visited families in town. The message was simple. Meeting at the old church on Sunday. Everyone who'd been hurt by Mercer. Everyone who was tired of being afraid. Come see the truth. Come stand together. Some people refused immediately. Others listened but made no promises. But a few, a precious few, said they'd be there. Sunday came cold and clear. Eliza dressed carefully, like she was going into battle, which, in a way, she was. The church sat at the edge of town, abandoned since the new one was built closer to the center. Its paint was peeling and its windows were cracked, but it still had a roof and enough pews to hold a crowd. If a crowd came. Eliza and Caleb arrived early, spreading out the evidence on a table at the front. Copied contracts. Testimonies. A list of families displaced, businesses destroyed, lives ruined. Then they waited. For the first hour, no one came. Eliza's stomach twisted with every minute that passed empty. They're not coming, Caleb said quietly. Give them time. Eliza, give them time. And then slowly they arrived. Mrs. Henderson with her husband and hollow-eyed children. The Kowalskis. A farmer Eliza didn't recognize. A widow who'd lost her boarding house. Rachel from the saloon, looking scared but determined. One by one, two by two, they filled the pews. Not everyone, not even close, but enough to start. Eliza stood at the front and felt her hands shake. She'd organized mill girls before, but that had been different. That had been among equals, among friends. This was standing up in front of strangers and asking them to risk everything. Thank you for coming, she started, her voice not quite steady. I know it took courage. I know you're afraid. I know some of you are thinking about leaving right now before anyone sees you here. A few uncomfortable shifts in the pews, but no one left. Wade Mercer has spent years building power in this valley. He's done it by finding desperate people and offering them hope, then trapping them in contracts designed to fail. He's done it quietly, one family at a time, making sure you never realized you weren't alone. She gestured to the papers on the table. But you're not alone. Everyone in this room has been hurt by the same man using the same methods. And if we stand together, we can stop him. How? Someone called from the back. He owns the judge. He owns the sheriff. What can we do? We can make noise, Eliza said. We can make this public. We can force the territorial authorities to investigate. We can show that his contracts are fraudulent, his practices are predatory, and his power is built on lies. And if that doesn't work? Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice shaking. If we stand up and nothing changes except we lose what little we have left? Then at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have stood together. Eliza looked around the room. I know I'm asking a lot. I know I'm asking you to risk everything. But the alternative is watching him take everything anyway, one piece at a time, until there's nothing left. Silence. Heavy and uncertain. Then Caleb stood. Eliza's right. I've been paying Mercer for 2 years, trying to dig myself out of a debt that only gets bigger. I thought I was alone. Thought it was my problem to solve. He looked around the room. But we're all in the same trap. And the only way out is through, together. More silence. Then Mrs. Kowalski stood. He took our shop, our livelihood, everything we built. Another woman stood. He foreclosed on my boarding house when I was 3 days late with a payment. 3 days. One by one they stood, sharing stories, naming injuries, building collective rage from individual grief. And Eliza felt something shift in the room, something fragile but real. The beginning of solidarity, of strength in numbers. So what do we do? Rachel asked. Eliza took a breath. We document everything, every contract, every testimony, every witness. We take it to the territorial governor if we have to, and we don't back down. Not until Mercer faces consequences for what he's done. He'll fight back, someone warned. Let him fight. We'll be ready. The meeting lasted another hour, people sharing information, making plans, building a coalition from scattered victims. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't guaranteed to work, but it was a start. As people filed out, several came up to thank Eliza personally, to squeeze her hand or offer quiet words of support. Mrs. Henderson was the last to leave. "You're either very brave or very foolish," she said. "I've been told that before. Either way, thank you. For seeing us, for caring enough to try. We're not done yet." "I know, but you started something today. That matters." After everyone left, Eliza and Caleb stood alone in the empty church, surrounded by evidence and the ghosts of people's broken lives. "That went better than expected," Caleb said. "That went terribly. Half the people who should have been here didn't show up. But half did. That's more than we had yesterday." Eliza leaned against him, suddenly exhausted. "What if this doesn't work? What if we've just made things worse?" Caleb wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Then we'll figure out the next step, together." "Together," Eliza repeated. The word felt like a promise, like a foundation solid enough to build on. They left the church as the sun was setting, painting the Montana sky in shades of fire. Tomorrow they'd continue the fight. Tomorrow they'd face whatever consequences came from standing up. But tonight, riding home in comfortable silence, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Fragile and uncertain, but real. They were halfway home when they saw it, smoke rising from the direction of the ranch. Caleb kicked his horse into a gallop, and Eliza followed, her heart in her throat. Please, she thought, please let it just be a grass fire. Please let it be anything else. But as they crested the hill, she saw the truth. The barn was burning, flames reaching toward the darkening sky like desperate hands. The barn was already half gone by the time they reached it, flames eating through dry wood like it was paper. Caleb was off his horse before it fully stopped, running toward the inferno with Eliza shouting behind him. "The cattle!" he yelled back. "They're in the near pasture!" But the cattle were already scattering, spooked by the smoke and heat. Eliza could see them bolting toward the far fence line, away from the flames. At least that was something. She ran to the well, started hauling water in buckets that felt impossibly small against the roaring fire. Caleb joined her, both of them working frantically, even though they both knew it was pointless. The barn was lost, had been lost before they'd even arrived. This wasn't about saving the structure. It was about keeping the fire from spreading to the cabin, to the garden, to everything else they'd been building. They worked until their hands blistered and their lungs burned from smoke. Worked until the barn collapsed in on itself with a sound like the world breaking. Worked until there was nothing left but charred timber and ash that glowed orange in the darkness. Only then did Caleb sink to his knees in the dirt, staring at the ruins. Eliza stood beside him, her dress soaked and filthy, her face streaked with soot. "It's not an accident," she said quietly. "No. Mercer. Or someone working for him. Same thing." Caleb's voice was flat, empty. "This is what happens when you stand up, when you make noise. He burns you out. We don't know it was him. Don't we?" Caleb looked up at her, and in the firelight, his face looked like something carved from stone. "We hold a meeting. We gather evidence. We convince people to speak out against the most powerful man in the valley. And hours later, my barn mysteriously catches fire. What else would you call it?" Eliza had no answer, because he was right. This was retaliation. This was a message: back down or lose everything. "The cabin's safe," she said instead. "The cattle are safe. We can rebuild. With what money? What materials?" Caleb laughed, bitter and harsh. "I was barely keeping this place running before. Now I've lost my barn, my equipment, probably half my winter feed. How exactly do you propose we rebuild?" "The same way we've done everything else, one step at a time." "That's not an answer. That's wishful thinking. It's all we've got." Caleb stood abruptly, brushing past her toward the cabin. Eliza followed, her heart sinking. She'd seen this before, the moment when fight turned to despair, when people who'd stood up decided it wasn't worth the cost. Inside, Caleb poured himself a drink from a bottle Eliza hadn't known he had. His hands shook as he raised the glass. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't give up. Don't let him win. He's already won. This?" He gestured toward the window, toward the smoking ruins outside. "This is what winning looks like." "No," This is what being afraid looks like. He's scared of what we're doing, so he's trying to scare us back. Well, it worked. Caleb drained the glass and poured another. I'm scared. I'm scared of losing what little I have left. I'm scared of watching you get hurt because I was stupid enough to think we could fight a man with unlimited resources and no conscience. Eliza crossed the room and took the bottle from his hands. I didn't come 2,000 miles and clear a dead woman's garden and break into a bank and organize the most stubborn people in Montana just to watch you fall apart now. Maybe you should have. Maybe you should have listened when I tried to send you away. But I didn't, and I'm not leaving now. Even after this? Even knowing what he's capable of? Especially after this. Eliza set the bottle on the shelf, out of reach. Well, see, because now I know we're hurting him. Now I know he's desperate enough to break the law to shut us up. That means we're winning, Caleb, not losing. That's insane. No. What's insane is letting him burn down your barn and then handing him your land on a silver platter because you're too tired to keep fighting. She grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to look at her. I know you're exhausted. I know you're scared. I am too. But giving up now means everyone who came to that meeting, everyone who risked everything to stand with us, was wrong to trust us. Is that what you want? Caleb's eyes were red-rimmed. Whether from smoke or emotion, Eliza couldn't tell. I don't know what I want anymore. Yes, you do. You want your land, your life, your future. You want to wake up without a boot on your neck. You want... She stopped, swallowing hard. You want to stop being the man who sent 5 women away because he was too broken to imagine being whole again. That landed. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened, the way something shifted behind his eyes. That's not fair, he said quietly. Nothing about this is fair, but it's true. They stood there in the dim cabin, smoke smell clinging to their clothes and despair hanging heavy as winter fog. Then Caleb pulled away, walking to the window to stare out at the ruins of his barn. What do we do? He asked finally. We document this. We add it to the evidence. We show that Mercer's not just a predatory lender, he's an arsonist willing to destroy property to intimidate witnesses. You can't prove he did this. Not directly, but I can prove he had motive and opportunity. I can create a timeline showing that this fire happened hours after our meeting. I can demonstrate a pattern of retaliation against anyone who opposes him. Eliza moved to stand beside him. It's not enough for a conviction, but it's enough to make territorial authorities ask questions, enough to make him uncomfortable. And if he retaliates again, burns down the cabin next time, hurts someone, then we deal with it, together. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he turned to face her fully. I don't deserve you. Probably not, but you're stuck with me anyway. Something that might have been a smile ghosted across his face. Stubborn woman, you knew that when you let me stay. I did. He reached out, tucking a strand of soot-streaked hair behind her ear. The gesture was gentle, tentative. When this is over, you're building me a proper barn, with actual lumber instead of hope and prayer. Deal. They spent what was left of the night salvaging what they could from the barn ruins, tools that had survived, equipment that could be repaired. It was grim work, sorting through ash and char for anything worth saving, but it gave them something to do besides sit and stew in anger. As dawn broke gray and cold, Eliza surveyed the damage in full light. It was worse than she'd thought. The barn was a total loss. The winter hay, critical for feeding cattle through Montana's brutal winters, was gone. Equipment they couldn't afford to replace lay twisted and unusable, but the cabin still stood. The garden was untouched. The cattle, though scattered, were mostly accounted for. They'd lost a battle. But the war wasn't over. Caleb was checking the cattle in the far pasture when the rider approached. Eliza saw him coming from a distance, recognized the expensive horse, the fine coat. Wade Mercer, come to survey his handiwork. She met him in the yard, her hands still dirty from the morning's salvage work. You've got some nerve showing up here. Mercer dismounted, his expression carefully neutral. I heard about the fire. Terrible tragedy. I came to offer my condolences. Save it. Mrs. Voss, I understand you're upset. Upset? Eliza laughed, sharp and cold. I'm furious, and I know you did this. That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof? Not yet, but I will. Mercer's smile was patient, patronizing. Barn fires are common out here. Dry wood, oil lamps, accidents happen. It's unfortunate, but hardly criminal. The timing's convenient, though, isn't it? Hours after we hold a meeting exposing your business practices, our barn mysteriously burns down. Correlation isn't causation, Mrs. Voss. I'd be careful about making accusations you can't substantiate. Slander is a serious matter. Eliza stepped closer, close enough to see her reflection in his cold eyes. You think you've won. You think burning down our barn will scare us into backing down. But all you've done is prove that we're right about you. Prove that you're desperate enough to commit arson to protect your empire of fraud. Strong words from a woman whose husband owes me $2,000. Fraudulent debt built on predatory contracts. We've got copies of those contracts now. We've got testimonies from your victims. We've got evidence of a pattern of abuse stretching back years. For the first time, something flickered across Mercer's face. Not fear exactly, but awareness, calculation. Even if that were true, he said carefully, who would believe you? A desperate mail-order bride and a grieving widower making wild accusations against a respected businessman. The territorial governor might believe us. Federal investigators definitely would. You think you can get their attention? You think anyone cares about a few failed ranchers in the middle of nowhere? I think you're scared enough of what we might accomplish that you burned down our barn. That tells me everything I need to know. Mercer's expression hardened. Let me be clear, Mrs. Voss. You're playing a dangerous game. Barn fires can spread. Accidents can happen to people as easily as property. It would be a shame if something happened to you or your husband because you couldn't mind your own business. Is that a threat? It's a warning. From someone who's seen what happens to people who push too hard against forces they don't understand. He remounted his horse. You have until the end of the month to settle your debt. After that, I'll be taking what I'm owed, one way or another. He rode away, leaving Eliza shaking with rage and adrenaline. Caleb emerged from the pasture, having witnessed the exchange from a distance. What did he say? He threatened us. Barely even bothered to hide it. We should tell the sheriff. The sheriff who owes him money? Who won't cross him? Eliza shook her head. No, we stick to the plan. We gather more evidence, build a stronger case, and take it over his head. And if he makes good on those threats, then we make sure everyone knows who's responsible. Over the next week, Eliza worked like a woman possessed. She rode to Bozeman, met with the lawyer Garrett had recommended, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Price, who listened to everything and promised to review the contracts. She wrote letters to the territorial governor, to federal land offices, to anyone who might have jurisdiction over Mercer's activities. She documented the fire, took statements from neighbors who'd seen unfamiliar riders near the ranch that night, built a timeline, created a narrative, assembled evidence into something that looked less like desperate accusations and more like a prosecutable case. Caleb worked alongside her, his initial despair hardening into determination. They were broke, their barn was ashes, winter was coming fast, but they were fighting back, and that counted for something. The response to their meeting rippled through the valley in unexpected ways. Some people pulled back, scared by the barn fire into renewed silence, but others grew bolder. Rachel started collecting testimonies at the saloon, recording stories from people who'd lost everything to Mercer's schemes. The Kowalskis organized a petition. Mrs. Henderson started a fund to help families displaced by foreclosures. Small acts of resistance, tiny sparks of rebellion. And Mercer noticed. He started appearing around town more often, making his presence felt. Friendly conversations that carried implicit threats. Reminders of who held power, who controlled credit, who decided which businesses succeeded and which failed. But he'd miscalculated, because fear only works when people are isolated, when they think they're alone against overwhelming force. And now, thanks to Eliza's stubborn organizing, people knew they weren't alone. The coalition grew, slowly, painfully, but it grew. 2 weeks after the fire, Margaret Price sent word. She'd found irregularities in multiple contracts. Not just Caleb's, not just the families Eliza had interviewed. Dozens of contracts, all with the same predatory structures, all potentially fraudulent under territorial law. This is enough for an investigation, Price wrote. I'm submitting a formal complaint to the territorial attorney. It'll take time, but you've built a solid case. Eliza showed the letter to Caleb, her hands trembling with something between hope and terror. We did it, she said. We actually did it. Don't celebrate yet. An investigation isn't a conviction. But it's a start. It's momentum. Caleb pulled her close, and Eliza let herself lean into him. They'd been living in survival mode for so long, barely sleeping, always watching for the next attack, existing on anxiety and coffee. This moment of something resembling victory felt strange and fragile. Whatever happens next, Caleb said quietly, I want you to know, I'm glad you stayed. Glad you didn't give up on this stubborn bastard. Someone had to be stubborn enough for both of us. You succeeded. They stood there in the cabin that had become a home, holding each other while outside the Montana wind howled, and the first snow of winter began to fall. The summons came 3 days later. Not for Mercer. That would be too easy. For Caleb, demanding he appear at the bank to discuss his defaulted loan. It's a trap, Eliza said immediately. Of course it's a trap. But if I don't go, he'll use it as evidence that I'm refusing to honor my debts. That I'm coming with you. Eliza, I'm coming. You're not walking into that alone. They rode to town together, Eliza wearing her best dress, the one she'd arrived in, cleaned and mended as well as she could manage. If this was going to be a confrontation, she'd face it looking like someone who deserved to be taken seriously. The bank was fuller than usual when they arrived. Not with customers, with witnesses. Mercer had assembled an audience, the judge, the sheriff, several prominent businessmen, all people who owed him favors or money or both. Mr. Voss, Mercer said, gesturing to a chair. Thank you for coming. I'm afraid we have some serious matters to discuss. I'm aware of my debt, Caleb said. I'm working on repayment. Are you? Because by my accounting, you're now 3 months in default with no viable plan to settle what you owe. Your accounting is fraudulent. The room went quiet. Mercer's smile didn't waver. That's a serious accusation. It's a true one. Your contract contains predatory interest rates and penalty clauses designed to make repayment impossible. I've consulted with an attorney who agrees that the terms violate territorial lending laws. Have you now? Mercer pulled out a different document. Then perhaps your attorney can explain this. A deed of trust you signed 2 years ago, putting up your land as collateral against the loan. Which means, if you default, which you have, I'm entitled to foreclose on the entire property. Eliza felt ice flood her veins. That's not in the original contract. It's a supplemental agreement, signed and witnessed. Mercer slid it across the desk. Caleb picked it up, his face going pale. The signature looked like his. The date was right, but I never signed this. The signature suggests otherwise. Then it's forged. I never agreed to put up the land. Can you prove that? Can you demonstrate that this isn't your signature? Caleb stared at the document, and Eliza saw realization dawn in his eyes. He'd been so broken after Sarah's death, so desperate for money to try to save her. He'd signed things without reading them, agreed to terms without understanding them. Maybe he had signed this. Maybe in his grief and desperation, he'd put everything at risk without even realizing it. Or maybe Mercer had forged it, counting on no one being able to prove otherwise. I want that document examined by a handwriting expert, Eliza said. Mercer's smile widened. Of course, though that will take time, and in the meanwhile, the foreclosure proceedings will continue. You can't foreclose based on a potentially fraudulent document. I can absolutely foreclose based on a legally executed deed of trust. Unless you can prove fraud, which you can't, the document stands. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. Mrs. Voss, I understand you're upset, but Mr. Mercer is within his legal rights. His legal rights? Eliza turned on the judge. You mean the legal rights he bought when you borrowed $1,500 from him? The legal rights that depend on you looking the other way while he ruins families? The judge's face went red. That's defamatory. It's documented. We have copies of your loan agreement. We have testimonies from dozens of families he's destroyed using the exact same methods. We have evidence of a pattern of fraud, intimidation, and corruption that goes straight to the top of this town's power structure. The room erupted. Multiple people talking at once, the sheriff moving forward like he might actually arrest Eliza for speaking the truth. Mercer sitting back in his chair watching the chaos with satisfied eyes. This was what he wanted. Public humiliation, a demonstration of power, proof that he could destroy them even when they fought back. But Eliza wasn't done. You can foreclose, she said, her voice cutting through the noise. You can take our land. You can burn our barn and threaten our lives and hide behind corrupt officials and fraudulent documents. But you can't stop what we've started. And what's that? Mercer asked, amused. People talking, people organizing, people realizing that they're not alone, that they don't have to accept your abuse just because you've got money and lawyers. Eliza pulled out her own papers, copies of contracts, testimonies, the letter from Margaret Price. We've filed complaints with the territorial attorney. We've documented your pattern of predatory lending across dozens of cases. We've gathered witnesses willing to testify under oath about your business practices. Witnesses you intimidated into turning against me. Witnesses you terrorized into silence for years. We just gave them permission to speak up. Mercer stood, and for the first time since she'd met him, Eliza saw real anger crack through his polished exterior. You have no idea what you're dealing with. I know exactly what I'm dealing with. I dealt with men like you in Boston, factory owners who thought they could treat workers like machines because they had the law on their side. Know what happened to them? Enlighten me. They lost, not immediately, not easily, but eventually people got organized enough and angry enough to force change. That's what's happening here. You can take our ranch, but you can't stop the investigation, can't stop people from testifying, can't stop the truth from coming out. The truth is that you're a desperate woman married to a failed rancher, making wild accusations to avoid legitimate debts. Then why are you so angry? Eliza stepped closer. If we're just desperate failures making wild accusations, why bother with this whole performance? Why assemble all these witnesses? Why threaten us? Why burn down our barn? I didn't. You did. Maybe not personally. Maybe you paid someone. But you did it. Just like you've done it to others who got in your way. And now that's part of the record, too. The silence that followed was electric. Everyone in the room knew what she was saying was true. They'd all heard the stories, seen the pattern, but no one had been brave enough or foolish enough to say it out loud. Until now. Mercer's expression went cold. Get out of my bank. Gladly. Eliza took Caleb's arm. We'll see you in court. The real court. Not this staged performance. They walked out together, heads high, while behind them the carefully assembled audience erupted into chaos. Outside, Caleb let out a breath he'd been holding. That was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever seen. Same thing, usually. Eliza's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. Did you really sign that deed of trust? I don't know. Maybe. Those weeks after Sarah died are a blur. I might have signed anything if I thought it would help. He looked at her. We're going to lose the ranch, aren't we? Maybe. Probably. Unless the investigation moves faster than foreclosure proceedings. Which it won't. Which it won't. They stood on the street outside the bank, facing the reality they'd been avoiding. Even if they won eventually, even if the investigation led to charges, to conviction, to Mercer's empire crumbling, it wouldn't happen fast enough to save their land. So what do we do? Caleb asked. Eliza thought about it, about the letters she'd sent, the testimonies she'd gathered, the network of resistance she'd helped build, about the garden behind the cabin and the way Caleb had finally learned to smile again, about coming 2,000 miles to find a home and discovering that home was something you built, not something you found. We fight anyway, she said. We fight knowing we might lose. We fight because it's the right thing to do. And because other people are counting on us, and because giving up now means he wins completely instead of just mostly. That's not very comforting. No, but it's honest. Caleb pulled her close right there on the street, not caring who saw. When I tried to send you away that first night, I thought I was protecting you from this, from getting hurt by my mess. You were protecting yourself from having to care about someone again. Yeah, that too. He kissed her forehead. I'm glad you didn't listen. Me too. They rode home through early winter snow, the valley stretching white and cold around them. The cabin waited, small but solid. The garden lay dormant under frost, seeds sleeping until spring. If they were still here in spring, if they managed to hold on through winter and foreclosure and whatever else Mercer threw at them. If. But for now they had each other, had a coalition of people who'd found courage to speak up, had evidence submitted and investigations pending, and the small, stubborn satisfaction of knowing they hadn't gone down without a fight. It wasn't victory, not yet, maybe not ever, but it was something. That night, Eliza sat at the kitchen table writing more letters while Caleb worked on repairing equipment salvaged from the fire. Domestic and determined, building what they could while they could. "I've been thinking," Caleb said eventually, dangerous habit, "about the marriage. The real one, I mean. Not just the pretend arrangement we started with." Eliza looked up from her letter. "What about it?" "We should make it official. Before the foreclosure, before whatever happens next. I want you to be my wife-in-law, not just in practice." "Why?" "Because if we lose the ranch, I want you to be protected. Want you to have legal standing, legal rights. Can't do that if we're just two people living together on a handshake agreement." "That's very practical." "It is. Also romantic in a weird Caleb kind of way." He almost smiled. "Is that a yes?" Eliza set down her pen. "Yes, but not because I need legal protection. Because I want to marry you, the real you, the man who finally stopped hiding behind grief and let himself care about someone again. I'm not sure I'm worth caring about. Let me be the judge of that." They married 3 days later in the same abandoned church where they'd held their first meeting. No fancy clothes, no flowers, no celebration, just Judge Whitmore, who agreed to perform the ceremony despite everything, perhaps feeling guilty about his own compromises, and Rachel as witness. The ceremony took 5 minutes. The words were standard, the promises simple. But when Caleb slipped a ring onto Eliza's finger, a thin gold band that had belonged to his mother, something shifted. Something that had been fragile became solid. Something that had been temporary became permanent. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Whitmore said, his voice heavy with things unsaid. Caleb kissed Eliza, and she tasted smoke and desperation and stubborn hope all mixed together. "Well," Rachel said afterward, "that's done. Now what?" "Now we wait," Eliza said. "Wait for the investigation. Wait for the foreclosure. Wait to see which comes first. And if the foreclosure wins, then we start over somewhere else, together." "You'd really leave? After all this fighting?" Eliza looked at Caleb, at the man she'd married twice now, once out of desperation, once out of choice. "The land matters, but it's not what I came here for. Not really." "What did you come for?" "A place to stand, a reason to keep going." She took Caleb's hand. "Turns out I found both, and they're portable." They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, newly married and still fighting for a future that might not include the land they were fighting for. The irony wasn't lost on Eliza, but she'd learned something in the months since arriving in Montana. Home wasn't about the place. It was about the people, about finding someone willing to stand beside you in the ruins and start building anyway. She'd found that. Against all odds, despite everything, she'd found it. Whatever came next, foreclosure or investigation, victory or defeat, they'd face it together. And that, Eliza decided, was enough. The letter from Margaret Price arrived on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks before the foreclosure deadline. Eliza recognized the handwriting and felt her stomach drop. Good news rarely required legal stationery. She opened it standing in the yard, snow falling around her in fat, lazy flakes that would have been beautiful if she'd had room in her heart for beauty. The territorial attorney had reviewed their evidence, found it compelling, opened a formal investigation into Wade Mercer's lending practices. But investigations took time, months, possibly years, and Caleb's foreclosure was scheduled for the 28th of December. Eliza read the letter twice, then walked into the cabin where Caleb was repairing harness leather salvaged from the fire. "Investigation's official," she said, handing him the letter. He read it, his expression never changing. "So we were right, but not fast enough." Not fast enough. They sat in silence, the weight of almost victory pressing down like the Montana winter. They'd done everything right, gathered evidence, organized victims, built a case strong enough to trigger official action, and it still wasn't enough to save what they'd been fighting for. "We could leave now," Caleb said quietly. "Pack what we can carry and go before he forecloses. Start somewhere else without the stain of losing everything. Is that what you want?" "I want to not watch him take this place. want to not give him the satisfaction. Eliza understood the impulse. She'd felt it in Boston, watching the mill owners win while workers starved. The desire to leave before the final humiliation, to preserve some scrap of dignity. But she'd learned something since then. Something about the difference between dignity and surrender. "I want to stay," she said. "Want to be here when the foreclosure happens. Want him to see our faces and know that we didn't run. That we fought until there was nothing left to fight with." "That's just pride." "Maybe. But it's our pride, and it's all we've got left." Caleb studied her face, and something softened in his expression. "You really are the most stubborn woman in Montana." "Good thing you married me then." "Yeah, it is." The next days passed in strange limbo. They worked the ranch knowing it wouldn't be theirs much longer. Fed cattle that Mercer would own. Repaired fences that would mark someone else's property. Lived in a home that was already haunted by its own future. But they kept working anyway, because stopping felt like dying, and neither of them was ready for that. Word of the investigation spread through the valley faster than Eliza expected. People started coming by. Not many, but enough, bringing food they couldn't spare, offering help they couldn't afford to give. The Hendersons showed up with a ham. Mrs. Kowalski brought preserves. Rachel arrived with a bottle of whiskey and a grim smile. "Heard you're going down swinging," Rachel said, pouring drinks for all three of them. "Something like that," Eliza said. "Good, someone needs to." Rachel raised her glass. "To lost causes and the idiots who fight for them anyway." They drank to that. To stubborn hope and practical despair and everything in between. "Investigation won't save you," Rachel said after the second drink. "You know that." "We know." "But it'll hurt him. Maybe not enough, maybe not soon enough, but it'll hurt." "That's something." "Yeah, it is." Rachel poured another round. More than most people manage. She left at sunset, and Eliza stood on the porch watching her go. The valley stretched white and cold in every direction, beautiful and brutal and unforgiving. She'd come here desperate and broken, thinking this place might save her. Instead, she'd saved herself. Had found strength she didn't know she had built something from nothing, had learned that survival wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to quit even when quitting made sense. "Come inside," Caleb called from the doorway. "You'll freeze." Eliza went in, and they ate dinner by lamplight, talking about nothing important. The weather, the cattle, whether they'd have enough feed to last until spring that wouldn't be theirs. Small talk, normal talk, the kind of conversation married people had when the world wasn't ending around them. It felt like practicing for a life they might have someday, somewhere else. 5 days before the foreclosure, a rider arrived. Not Mercer this time. Someone Eliza didn't recognize, a young man in territorial government uniform, his horse exhausted from hard riding. "Mrs. Voss?" he asked, dismounting. "That's me." "I have a message from District Judge Harrison in Helena. He's received your complaint and reviewed the preliminary evidence. He wants to see you and your witnesses in Helena for a hearing." Eliza's heart jumped. "When?" "Week after next, January 6th. That's after the foreclosure." "I know. Judge Harrison apologizes for the delay, but his schedule doesn't matter." Eliza took the summons he was holding out. "We'll be there. All of us." The rider left, and Eliza stood holding the paper like it might dissolve if she looked at it wrong. A hearing, official, legal proceedings, everything they'd been fighting for, just 10 days too late to matter. Caleb came out, read the summons over her shoulder. "Well, that's ironic. We could ask for an injunction, stop the foreclosure until after the hearing." "Who would grant it? Judge Whitmore? He's not going to cross Mercer." "There has to be something we can do." "There isn't." Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. "We fought. We built a case. We triggered an investigation that'll probably destroy Mercer eventually, but we can't stop this foreclosure, not legally." "Then illegally." "Eliza, I'm serious. What if we just refuse to leave, make him physically remove us, create a scene public enough that what? That people feel bad while we get dragged out by the sheriff?" Caleb shook his head. "We've already won the important fight. We exposed him, started something bigger than just our ranch. Don't throw that away for a gesture that won't change anything." Eliza knew he was right, knew that martyrdom was self-indulgent when you'd already accomplished something real. but the unfairness of it burned like acid in her chest. "I hate this," she said. "Me too. I hate that he gets to win even while losing. He's not winning, not really. His empire's crumbling. Might take months or years, but it's crumbling. We did that. Doesn't feel like enough. No, but it's what we've got." That night, Eliza couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, their bed now, not Sarah's bed, a subtle shift that had happened gradually over months, and stared at the ceiling, thinking. There had to be something. Some angle they'd missed, some leverage they hadn't used. She'd spent her whole life fighting losing battles, and she'd learned that losing battles sometimes turned around in the final hour if you were stubborn enough or creative enough or desperate enough. She got up quietly, careful not to wake Caleb, and went to the kitchen table. Spread out all their evidence, all their documentation, looking for something she'd overlooked. Contracts, testimonies, timelines, letters. Eliza stared at the pile of correspondence, her mind working. They'd written to the territorial attorney, to the governor, to various officials. All the proper channels, all the official routes. But what about improper channels? Unofficial routes? She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and started writing. To the editor of the Helena Independent, "My name is Eliza Voss, and I am writing to expose a pattern of fraud and corruption that has devastated families across the Montana Territory." She wrote for 2 hours, laying out everything. Names, dates, specific examples. The Hendersons, the Kowalskis, the Chens. Dozens of families ruined by predatory lending and fraudulent contracts. She named Judge Whitmore and his debts. Named the sheriff and his conflicts of interest. Named every corrupt official who'd enabled Mercer's empire. And she named Mercer himself. Called him what he was. A thief hiding behind legal paperwork and bought officials. It was inflammatory. Possibly libelous. Definitely dangerous. She wrote it anyway. When she finished, Caleb was standing in the doorway, watching. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Fighting dirty." She showed him the letter. "We can't stop the foreclosure legally, but we can make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man is taking our land, can make him toxic, make it so no newspaper reader in the territory doesn't know his name and what he's done." Caleb read it, his expression unreadable. "This will make him furious." "Good. He could sue you for libel." "Let him. Discovery in a libel case would force him to prove these statements are false, which he can't do because they're true. It won't save the ranch. No, but it'll make sure his victory costs him something. Make sure people remember." Caleb set down the letter and pulled Eliza close. "You know what I love about you?" "What?" "You don't know when to quit." "Is that love or frustration?" "Both, definitely both." Eliza sent the letter the next morning, addressed to every newspaper she could think of. The Helena Independent, the Butte Miner, the Montana Post, even papers in Denver and San Francisco. She paid for the postage with the last of their money and felt something settle in her chest. They'd lose the ranch, but they wouldn't lose quietly. The foreclosure happened on a cold Thursday morning, exactly as scheduled. Mercer arrived with the sheriff and 2 hired men, all of them carrying official papers and expressions that tried for sympathy but landed somewhere near satisfaction. "Mr. and Mrs. Voss," Mercer said formally, "I'm here to execute the foreclosure on this property as authorized by territorial law and the deed of trust signed by Mr. Voss on March 15, 1874. "We know why you're here," Caleb said. "Then you'll understand I'm required to ask you to vacate the premises." "We understand." Mercer blinked, clearly expecting more resistance. "You're not going to fight this?" "Already fought it," Eliza said. "You won this particular battle. Congratulations." Something flickered across Mercer's face. Confusion, maybe. Or suspicion. He'd been expecting drama, expecting them to make a scene he could use to paint them as unreasonable. Instead, they stood there calm and resigned, denying him that satisfaction. "You have until sundown to remove your personal possessions," he said. "After that, everything remaining becomes property of the bank." "Understood." Mercer waited, like he was hoping for more. When nothing came, he nodded stiffly and retreated to his horse, leaving the sheriff to oversee their departure. Eliza and Caleb had already packed what mattered. Clothes, a few tools, Sarah's photograph, and the letters from the other brides. Everything else, furniture, equipment, the structure itself, could stay. They'd built what mattered into themselves. They loaded the wagon in silence while the sheriff watched, clearly uncomfortable with his role, but unwilling to defy Mercer. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I know this isn't fair." "Then why are you enforcing it?" Eliza asked. "Because it's the law." "No, it's a perversion of the law. There's a difference." The sheriff had no answer to that. As they prepared to leave, neighbors started arriving. The Hendersons, the Kowalskis, Rachel from the saloon, Mrs. Chen and her husband, Garrett from the general store. One by one, they came, standing witness to what was happening. Not to stop it. They couldn't stop it, but to bear witness, to make sure Mercer understood that this victory was being watched and recorded and remembered. "What are they doing here?" Mercer demanded, riding back over. "Standing," Rachel said simply. "We're allowed to stand on public property, aren't we?" "This is private property." "Not yet, it isn't. Not until sundown." She smiled, sharp as broken glass. "We're just here to watch the last few hours. Make sure everything's done proper and legal." Mercer's jaw worked. He knew what this was. Knew they were turning his victory into theater, into something that would be talked about and analyzed and used against him. But he couldn't stop them. They were within their rights, standing on the road, watching. So he had to conduct his foreclosure with an audience. Had to take the land while 24 people bore witness to exactly how it was being taken. Eliza climbed onto the wagon seat beside Caleb, their possessions loaded behind them. The cabin stood empty now, waiting for its new owner. The garden lay dormant under snow, seeds sleeping through winter. "Ready?" Caleb asked. "No, but let's go anyway." He clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled forward. Eliza didn't look back at the cabin. Didn't give Mercer the satisfaction of seeing her cry over what they were losing. Instead, she looked at the people lining the road, at Mrs. Henderson holding her children, at the Kowalskis standing shoulder to shoulder, at Rachel raising a hand in silent salute, at the community they'd helped build from scattered, frightened individuals into something that looked almost like solidarity. They'd lost their home, but they'd won something bigger. They stayed with Rachel for the first week, sleeping on the floor above the saloon while they figured out next steps. The hearing in Helena was still scheduled, but they had no money for travel, no way to attend, until the donations started arriving. Envelopes slipped under Rachel's door, coins left on the bar with notes saying, "For the Vosses." Even a few larger contributions from people who'd heard about their fight and wanted to help. "People are talking," Rachel said, counting the money, "about what you did, about standing up to Mercer, about the foreclosure. Talking doesn't change anything, doesn't it? Half my customers last night were discussing Mercer's business practices, questioning whether they want to do business with him, wondering if their loans are as legitimate as they thought." Rachel grinned. "You're making him radioactive, slowly but definitely. Still doesn't get us our ranch back." "No, but it's something." 3 days before the Helena hearing, something else arrived. Newspapers. Copies of the Helena Independent, the Butte Miner, the Montana Post, all of them carrying Eliza's letter on the front page. Fraud in Montana Territory, one woman's fight against predatory lending. The story had caught fire exactly like Eliza had hoped. Editorial boards were demanding investigations. Other victims were coming forward with their own stories. Questions were being raised about judicial corruption and conflicts of interest. Mercer's name was everywhere, and none of it was good. "You did this," Caleb said, staring at the newspapers spread across Rachel's bar. "We did this. All of us." "But you started it. You were the one who refused to quit." Eliza looked at the papers, at her words printed for thousands to read, and felt something complicated bloom in her chest. Not victory, not exactly, but validation. Proof that speaking up mattered, even when it cost everything. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we go to Helena. Tell our story. Let the judge decide." They traveled to Helena with donations from the valley paying their way. The hearing was held in a proper courthouse, wood-paneled and official in ways that made Eliza nervous. She'd never trusted institutions, never believed that official power served anyone but itself. But she stood before District Judge Harrison and told their story anyway. Judge Harrison was older than she'd expected, his face lined with years of seeing the worst of humanity dressed up in legal language. He listened to Eliza's testimony without interruption, listened to Caleb describe the debt spiral, The impossible terms, the manufactured default. Listen to the Hendersons and Kowalskis, and a dozen other families tell similar stories. Then he reviewed the contracts, examined the deed of trust that had enabled the foreclosure, compared it to territorial lending laws and case precedents. The silence stretched so long, Eliza thought she might scream. Finally, Harrison looked up. Mrs. Voss, you've presented a compelling case of systematic fraud. The contracts you've submitted contain terms that violate territorial statutes regarding interest rates, penalty clauses, and disclosure requirements. He paused. However, the foreclosure on your specific property was executed legally based on the deed of trust, regardless of whether that deed should have been enforceable under proper lending standards. Eliza felt her heart sink. They'd won the argument but lost the case. That said, Harrison continued, I'm issuing an injunction against Mr. Mercer conducting any further foreclosures until a full investigation is completed. I'm also ordering him to provide copies of all loan contracts executed in the past 5 years for review by the Territorial Attorney's Office. And I'm referring multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and corruption to the Federal Marshal for Criminal Investigation. The courtroom erupted. Eliza grabbed Caleb's hand, hardly believing what she was hearing. What about our ranch? Caleb asked. Harrison looked at them over his spectacles. Your foreclosure was legal under the paperwork filed, but if the underlying debt is found to be fraudulent, which seems likely, you'll have grounds to sue for restoration of property and damages. That's a separate civil case, but based on what I've seen here, you'd have strong standing. How long would that take? Months? Possibly longer. And in the meantime? In the meantime, Mr. Mercer owns your land. I'm sorry. That's the best I can offer under current law. It wasn't enough. But it was more than they'd had yesterday. It was acknowledgement. Official recognition that they'd been wronged. A path, however long and uncertain, back to what they'd lost. Eliza stood. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me yet. You've got a long fight ahead, but you've also got momentum. Harrison gathered his papers. And you've got something else. You've made enough noise that people are paying attention. That matters more than you might think. They left the courthouse into cold Helena sunlight, surrounded by the other families who'd testified. Everyone was talking at once, excited and scared and cautiously hopeful. What now? Mrs. Henderson asked. Now we wait, Eliza said. Wait for the investigation. Build the civil case. Keep telling our stories until someone listens. And if that doesn't work, then we try something else, but we don't quit. The investigation took 6 months. 6 months of living in Rachel's spare rooms, of working odd jobs to pay for food, of waiting for official wheels to turn at their own glacial pace. But they turned. The federal marshal arrested Wade Mercer in April on charges of fraud, forgery, and racketeering. Judge Whitmore was removed from the bench for corruption. The sheriff resigned rather than face investigation into his own conflicts of interest. One by one, the pillars of Mercer's empire crumbled, and the loans, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, were declared fraudulent and void, including Caleb's. The letter came in May, official territorial seal and everything. Property illegally foreclosed, hereby ordered returned to original owners. All fraudulent debts declared null and void. Eliza read it 3 times before she believed it. Then she showed Caleb, her hand shaking so badly the paper rattled. We won, she said. We actually won. Caleb pulled her into a hug that lifted her feet off the ground. You won. You're the one who wouldn't quit. We won together. They returned to the ranch on a spring morning, the valley green and alive with possibility. The cabin stood empty but intact. Mercer had never bothered to sell it, too busy fighting legal battles. The garden was overgrown with weeds, but underneath, Eliza could see her plants from last year. Dormant. Waiting. Everything was waiting. They moved back in slowly, carefully, like the place might vanish if they claimed it too fast. But it stayed solid, stayed real. I need to rebuild the barn, Caleb said, surveying the charred remains. We need to rebuild the barn, Eliza corrected. Right, we. They worked through summer, rebuilding what had been destroyed. Neighbors helped, the Hendersons and Kowalskis and others who'd gotten their own properties back, who understood the value of solidarity forged in shared struggle. The garden flourished. Eliza planted tomatoes where Sarah had planted them, but also beans and squash and herbs. A continuation of what had been, but also something new. Something that belonged to this version of the ranch, this version of the family. By fall, they had a functioning barn, healthy cattle, and a harvest that would see them through winter. By winter, they had money saved and plans for expansion. By spring again, they had something that looked almost like prosperity. Not wealth. They'd never be wealthy, but security, stability, a life built on their own terms. And throughout the territory, things were changing. New lending regulations, closer oversight of judicial appointments, laws protecting borrowers from predatory contracts, small changes, incremental victories, but real. "You think we made a difference?" Caleb asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching sunset paint the mountains. "I think we made noise," Eliza said. "And noise gets people's attention, makes them ask questions. Sometimes that's enough." Sometimes. Sometimes has to be enough. Because perfect victories don't exist, just small wins that add up over time. Caleb took her hand. "I'm glad you stayed. Glad you were too stubborn to listen when I tried to send you away." "Me too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching day turn to night. Somewhere in the valley, other families were sitting on other porches, living lives they'd fought to keep. The Hendersons in their reclaimed farm, the Kowalskis rebuilding their blacksmith shop, Mrs. Chen planting crops that would actually be hers to harvest. None of it was perfect, none of it was easy, but it was theirs, and that mattered. The last of the other mail-order brides arrived in September. Catherine, the woman who'd written from Philadelphia 2 years earlier. She'd seen the newspaper articles about the case, about Eliza's fight, and decided to take a chance on Montana after all. "I heard you were the one who refused to leave," Catherine said, sitting in Eliza's kitchen drinking coffee. "I was too broke to leave," Eliza corrected. "Stubbornness came later." "Still, you fought, you won. That takes something special. It takes desperation and anger and not knowing when to quit. Not sure that's special. It is when most people give up long before they get that far." Eliza thought about that. About the line between giving up and knowing when to stop. About whether what she'd done was brave or just too stubborn to recognize futility. "I think we survived," she said finally. "That's not the same as winning. We survived, and we helped other people survive, and we made things slightly less terrible for whoever comes next. That's all." "That's everything," Catherine said. "That's the whole game." After Catherine left, heading to a ranch 30 miles west, another widower looking for a partner, Eliza stood in her garden and thought about how far she'd come. From Boston to Montana. From desperate and broken to something that resembled whole. From alone to married to loved. It hadn't been smooth. Hadn't been easy. She and Caleb still fought sometimes. Still struggled with money and weather and the 1,000 small failures that made up daily life. But they fought together now. Struggled as a team. And that made all the difference. "Eliza," Caleb called from the barn. "Need your help with something." She went, ready to argue about whatever he'd broken or miscalculated or attempted without proper planning, ready to stand beside him and figure it out anyway. Because that's what you did when you decided to stay. When you'd chosen this place, this person, this hard and beautiful and impossible life. You showed up, you worked, you survived. And sometimes, if you were stubborn enough and lucky enough and brave enough all at once, you did more than survive. You built something worth keeping. Years later, when people asked Eliza about that first winter, about arriving at a ranch that didn't want her, about fighting a man who seemed untouchable, about refusing to quit when quitting made sense, she never had a good answer. She'd tell them about the garden, about clearing weeds from Sarah's beds and planting seeds in frozen ground, about the way Caleb had finally learned to smile again, about the community that had found courage in shared struggle. But she couldn't explain why she'd stayed that first night when any sensible person would have left. Couldn't articulate what made her break into a bank or organize strangers or write letters that could have gotten her killed. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe desperation. Maybe just being too tired of running to run anymore. Or maybe it was something simpler. The recognition that some things were worth fighting for even when you couldn't win. That standing up mattered even when you fell down. That trying, really trying, with everything you had, was its own kind of victory regardless of outcome. She'd come to Montana with nothing. No money, no prospects, No reason to believe things would get better. She'd found something anyway. Not in the land or the cabin or even the man she'd married. She'd found it in herself. In the moment she'd walked into that filthy cabin and lit a fire in a dead stove and claimed her right to exist in a space that didn't want her, that fire had never gone out. It burned in the garden she tended, in the coalition she'd helped build, in the laws that had changed because she'd refused to accept injustice quietly. Most of all, it burned in the simple, stubborn insistence that she deserved a life, that everyone deserved a life, that power and money and legal paperwork didn't get the final say in who survived and who didn't. Sometimes you lost anyway. Sometimes the powerful won and the desperate died and all the fighting in the world didn't change the outcome, but sometimes, just sometimes, stubbornness was enough. Speaking up was enough. Refusing to quit was enough. And on those days, in those small victories, you learned something important, that courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about being terrified and moving forward anyway. About planting seeds in stony ground because you needed to believe that something could grow. Eliza had planted those seeds, and against all odds, against every reasonable expectation, they'd grown into something beautiful. Not perfect, not smooth, but real and solid and hers, and that was more than enough. That was everything.